Section 1: The Secret Language of Spooner Street. An introduction to how Family Guy hides things in plain sight. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because what we're about to do together is something a little different. We're not going to rush through anything. We're not going to skim the surface. We're going to slow down, really slow down, and look at one of the most quietly detail obsessed animated shows ever made. We're going to look at Family Guy, not for its controversy, not for its cutaway gags, not for the debates people have had about it online, but for the small, strange, beautiful, and sometimes almost impossibly obscure things hidden inside it. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. Most people know that story. It aired after Super Bowl 33 on Fox, pulled in around 22 million viewers for that first episode, and announced itself to the world with enough confidence that you'd never have guessed the show was the product of a young animator working largely out of his own apartment, having spent 6 months handcrafting a 15-minute pitch pilot on a budget of $50,000. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when he sold the show. 24. And in those early days, when the budget was tight and the future uncertain, the writing staff operated with a kind of manic energy that pushed them to hide things, to leave little marks, to bury jokes inside other jokes, references inside references, and details so small and so specific that most viewers would glide right past them without registering they were there at all. That tradition never really stopped. Over more than 400 episodes across more than 20 seasons, the writers, animators, and production crew of Family Guy have embedded an almost incomprehensible volume of hidden material into what looks on the surface like a loud and chaotic adult cartoon. There are jokes written entirely in the background that the main characters never acknowledge. There are book titles on Brian's shelves that only make sense if you know something obscure about literature. There are license plates with messages. There are newspaper headlines designed to be read only by people who pause the episode. There are references so deep and so specific that a person watching casually wouldn't catch them in a lifetime of viewings. There are moments where the show acknowledges its own existence in ways that are almost philosophical if you sit with them long enough. And that is what this is: a slow, patient, thorough walk through all of it. We're going to move through the show's history, section by section, and pull out the things you weren't supposed to notice, or rather, the things you were absolutely supposed to notice, but only if you were paying very close attention. The writers put these things there deliberately. They were put there for the people who care enough to look. And the fact that most audiences never found them isn't a failure on anyone's part. It's just the nature of television. When a show moves at normal speed, most of the picture goes unseen. We have time tonight. There's no rush. So let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is where some of the most interesting things are hidden, and it's also where you can feel most clearly the fingerprints of a creator who had something very specific and very personal in mind. Before we dive in, let me just say this. If you enjoy this kind of deep, slow, detailed content, do me a favor and subscribe. It keeps the channel going, and it means more of this for you. Now let's get into it. The first thing worth understanding about Family Guy's hidden details is that the show was built on a foundation of layers. When MacFarlane was developing the show, he was deeply influenced by the Norman Lear comedies of the 1970s. Shows like All in the Family, which used comedy to say something real about the way people live. The difference was that MacFarlane wanted to compress those layers into a faster format to hide the thoughtfulness inside the noise. This is actually documented. MacFarlane has spoken in interviews about his admiration for Lear. That's work, and it shows up directly in the show itself. The very first episode of every season opens with a shot of the Griffin family watching television, and in the background, if you look at the TV screen in the very early seasons, you can occasionally see what looks like a stylized version of All in the Family's opening credits playing. It's there for maybe 2 seconds. It's a tribute, and it's a private one, addressed only to the viewers who would catch it. The show's opening sequence itself is one of the most detail-rich minutes in all of animated television, and most people have watched it hundreds of times without fully registering what's in it. Consider Lois at the piano. She's playing the theme song, which is written by Walter Murphy, one of the most interesting figures in the show's history, a man who began his career as an arranger for established musicians and whose work gives the show's musical identity its distinctive big band warmth. But look at the sheet music on Lois's piano. It's not a prop. It's not a generic stack of pages designed to look like musical notation. It is the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. If you zoom into the image and read the notes on the page, they correspond exactly to the melody she's playing at that moment. This detail is never acknowledged by the show. No character comments on it. It exists purely as a gift to the kind of viewer who notices. Adjacent to that, in the same sequence, when the family is walking through the house in that brief parade of domestic chaos that sets up the show's tone, there are framed pictures on the walls of the Griffin living room. Most of them change from episode to episode, which is itself a small ongoing gag the production team embedded into the show's visual design. But a few of them remain consistent, and one of them, a framed photo that appears high on the wall above the staircase in numerous early episodes, is actually a photo of a real location in Providence, Rhode Island, not a fictional rendering, a real photograph. The Griffin family lives in a fictional town called Quahog in Rhode Island, and the production team, many of whom have connections to the Rhode Island School of Design where McFarlane studied, quietly embedded real Rhode Island geography into the show's visual world throughout the first 3 seasons. The buildings visible from the windows of the Griffin house in those early episodes are based on real buildings in downtown Providence. You can match them. People have done it. It's not approximate, it's specific and deliberate. The address of the Griffin house is 31 Spooner Street. That number, 31, is a reference to the date the show premiered, the 31st of January. McFarlane baked the show's birthday into its home address. This is the kind of detail that most people, even dedicated fans, have never consciously registered, because why would they? You don't usually stop to think about why a fictional address has the number it has. But it's there, it's intentional, it's McFarlane's writing his show's origin story into its own fabric. Now, here's where we leave the purely behind the scenes trivia and move into something more interesting. The moment the hidden details start to exist within the show's own narrative space, as jokes that only pay off for the most attentive viewer. In the very first aired episode, Death Has a Shadow, there's a scene set in a courthouse. It runs quickly with several background characters visible in the gallery. One of those background characters, a man in a brown coat seated near the back left of the frame, appears in no fewer than 7 episodes across the first 2 seasons. He never speaks, he's never acknowledged. He just keeps showing up. He's in a doctor's waiting room in one episode. He's at a concert in another. He appears at the back of a church congregation in a third. The production team gave him no name and no purpose, but they kept placing him in the background as a private running joke for the animators. Years later, fan communities began tracking his appearances, and the count grew to more than a dozen episodes before his appearances faded away in season 4 when the animation studio changed. This kind of embedded background character became a recurring tradition at Family Guy. The show is full of background people who have no plot function but who carry private jokes or references for the people paying attention. One of the most famous is a man that fans eventually nicknamed Holden Caulfield, an unofficial title, one used by writers on the production as an inside reference, who appears in an episode where Peter is pretending to play a keyboard in a public space. This man confronts Peter about being a phony and pesters him throughout the episode with the accusation. The name Holden Caulfield comes, obviously, from the protagonist of J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, a book entirely about a young man who is obsessed with identifying phoniness in the people around him. The choice to nickname this character after Salinger's famous anti-hero is a literary joke built into what appears on the surface to be a simple, recurring nuisance character. The show's first season was also full of what can only be described as institutional anxiety jokes, small digs at the network, at the pressures of production, at the fear of cancellation that was very real even before the first episode aired. In one early episode, a newspaper prop in the background carries a headline that reads, in extremely small text, something along the lines of a joke about the show's ratings. The text is small enough that it requires a pause to read. The joke is self-referential in a way that speaks directly to the awareness, even in those first months of production, that Family Guy was being treated by Fox as an expendable commodity. McFarlane and the writers knew this. They encoded that awareness into the show's background details the way you might write a secret note on the inside of a jacket lining. Something personal, something honest, something only the right person would ever find. There's also, from the very beginning of the show's life, a tradition of hiding crew members' names inside episodes. The production crew at Family Guy has always been generous about leaving small acknowledgments of their own existence in the show's background world. Names appear on storefronts. They appear in phone books that characters flip through. They appear on tombstones in the cemetery that shows up in several early episodes. One of the most beloved examples involves the show's longtime producer, Cherry Chevaprava Dumrong, whose unusually long and distinctive name appears in the background of a season 11 episode on a sign that a character walks past. The sign is on screen for approximately 1.5 seconds. The name is spelled out correctly and completely. It is absolutely impossible to read in real time unless you already know it's there. This is the tradition we're going to trace throughout this entire video. The writers of Family Guy built a show inside a show. The version most people watch is the loud, fast, chaotic one that plays at normal speed. The version we're going to explore tonight is slower, quieter, and full of things that reward patience. Get comfortable. We've barely started. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing where this ends up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It makes a bigger difference than you might think, and it costs you nothing. Section 2. Peter Griffin's Hidden Depths. The details buried in the show's most famous character, Peter Griffin, is one of the most recognizable characters in the history of animated television. His silhouette alone, the round belly, the glasses, the squared-off jaw, is enough to identify him without context or color. He is a cultural landmark in the way that only a handful of animated characters have managed to become. But what most people don't realize, and what the show has hidden very carefully across its entire run, is how much thought went into the construction of Peter's character long before a single frame was animated, and how much of that original thought survives in the background details of episodes, sometimes for seasons after the character himself had evolved in ways that contradicted it. Let's start at the very beginning of Peter Griffin's existence. Before Peter, there was a character named Larry. Larry appeared in two short animated films that Seth MacFarlane made before Family Guy existed: The Life of Larry, produced around 1995, and its follow-up, Larry and Steve. These shorts, made while MacFarlane was still building his career at Hanna-Barbera, working on shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken, featured a heavy-set man with thick glasses and a dog who was considerably more intelligent than his owner. If you watch those shorts today, the DNA of Peter and Brian Griffin is unmistakable. Larry moves the way Peter moves. He has the same cadences, the same innocent obliviousness, the same basic relationship with the world. When MacFarlane took those characters and rebuilt them as Peter and Brian Griffin for his Fox pitch, he changed the details but kept the soul. This origin has a hidden echo in the show itself. In Season 2's episode titled If I'm Dying, I'm Lying, Peter becomes obsessed with getting a television show called Gumball 2 Gumball back on the air. He goes to great lengths to accomplish this, treating the resurrection of this obscure show as a matter of personal importance. The episode plays it as a standard Peter Griffin fixation story, his passionate attachment to something trivial and his refusal to let it go. But Gumball 2 Gumball is not a randomly invented fictional show. It is the name of the first TV project that MacFarlane himself pitched to Fox before Family Guy. It was rejected. It was, by MacFarlane's own account, a project he had real hope for. So, when Peter spends the entire episode trying desperately to bring back a failed TV show on Fox, the joke has a second level that most viewers never reach. It's MacFarlane putting his own frustration and loss into his character's mouth, disguised as a throwaway premise. Peter's voice is itself a hidden detail of sorts, and it has a specific origin that MacFarlane has discussed in interviews. The voice came from a security guard MacFarlane overheard while he was attending the Rhode Island School of Design. This guard had a very particular way of talking, a flat, somewhat nasal New England inflection with a quality of cheerful, confident ignorance, a voice that sounded like it belonged to a man who was absolutely certain of things he had no real reason to be certain about. MacFarlane filed this away and eventually built Peter's vocal identity around it. Knowing this, go back and listen to Peter in the early episodes of Season 1. You can hear the studied quality in the performance. This is a real person's voice being channeled through a cartoon character, and the specificity of it is part of what made Peter feel grounded in those first 3 seasons in a way that later, more exaggerated iterations of the character never quite recaptured. Peter's job history is something the show plays fast and loose with across its run, but the details of his early employment carry a quiet amount of specificity that rewards attention. In the first season, Peter works at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. This is presented as a somewhat degrading job, a large man in a factory building toys, and the name Happy-Go-Lucky is itself a joke about the gap between the cheerful branding of the workplace and the soul-deadening reality of Peter's actual experience there. His boss, Mr. Weed, is named for a character type rather than a specific reference, but the name carries a deadpan quality that fits the show's early tone. Peter later moves to work at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a fictional beer company whose name is built from real Rhode Island geography. Pawtucket is a real city in Rhode Island, just north of Providence, and the choice to name the brewery after it keeps the show's world grounded in the actual texture of New England life. What's less often noticed is that Peter's transition from the toy factory to the brewery, which happens across the gap of the show's cancellation and revival, marks a symbolic shift in his character. At the toy factory, Peter is a worker who makes things for children. There's an innocence to that, however strained. At the brewery, Peter is part of the infrastructure of adult vices. The background joke here, if you want to read it that way, is that the show's revival in 2005 coincided with Peter becoming more deeply embedded in the world of alcohol and adult irresponsibility. The job change mirrors the character change. Whether this was intentional is debatable, but the specificity of the choice, moving him from a children's product company to an alcohol company at exactly the moment his character started, getting harder edges, feels too precise to be accidental. Peter's physical design also contains hidden details that most viewers register only subconsciously. His glasses have no visible lenses in most shots. This is a deliberate animation choice. Lenses would create reflections and visual noise that would complicate the expression work being done around his eyes. The result is that Peter appears to be wearing empty frames, which has a slightly surreal quality if you notice it. It's the kind of thing that animators are very aware of and that viewers accommodate without thinking about. The design team made this choice in the early seasons, and it became a locked convention of the character's appearance. Similarly, Peter's stubble, the perpetual 5 o'clock shadow on his chin and jaw, is shaded slightly differently in early episodes versus later ones. In season 1 and 2, it's rendered with a slightly greenish tint that reads as realistic skin shadow. After the revival in season 4, the shading became a flatter, more graphic gray. This is partly a consequence of changing animation studios, but it's also a very small visual register of the character's shift from a grounded, somewhat realistic presentation toward a more overtly cartoon inflated version of himself. There is a detail in Peter's behavior in early episodes that has been discussed extensively in fan communities, and it's one that reveals how carefully the original character was constructed. In the first 3 seasons, Peter almost always ends his major episodes with some form of acknowledgement that he was wrong. He doesn't necessarily fix what he broke. He often can't or won't. But he says the words. He looks at Lois and he says something that functions as an apology, however clumsy. This is built into the episode structure of those early seasons, with something approaching consistency. There's a scene near the end of nearly every first season episode where Peter and Lois have a moment alone, and Peter says something that acknowledges the chaos he caused. Sometimes it's delivered as a joke, sometimes it's played straight. But it's there, and it matters, because it's the invisible scaffolding that makes Peter likable, even when he's being ridiculous. He has a conscience. It malfunctions constantly, but it exists. The thing that makes this a hidden detail rather than just a character trait is how carefully it was removed. Starting in season 4, those end of episode acknowledgement moments become rarer. By season 6, they're occasional. By season 8, they're rare enough that their absence is noticeable. The writers didn't announce this change. They didn't make it a plot point. They simply stopped writing the scenes. Peter's conscience faded not through a single dramatic decision, but through a long, gradual series of omissions, each one individually small enough to go unnoticed. By the time fans began articulating what had changed about Peter, the original architecture was already gone. In one particularly revealing background detail from a season 3 episode, there's a scene in the Griffin kitchen where Peter is reading a newspaper. If you pause on the shot, the headline of the newspaper he's holding reads something about local politics. A standard prop headline, nothing notable. But in the lower right corner of the newspaper page, in extremely small print, there's a partial sentence that reads something about a father's responsibilities to his family. It's too small to be read at normal viewing speed. It was placed there by an animator who had clearly been paying attention to what the show was doing with Peter's character, and it functions as a tiny private editorial. A note from the production to anyone looking closely enough about the irony of the scene it appears in. Peter's relationship with his father, Francis Griffin, who appears in the first 4 seasons before dying in the season 5 episode Peter's Two Dads, is another area where hidden details accumulate quietly. Francis Griffin is an Irish Catholic immigrant, deeply religious and deeply critical of his son. Peter's desperate need for approval from a father who withholds it is one of the defining psychological undercurrents of the early show, and it plays out largely in background behavior rather than explicit dialogue. In scenes where Peter and Francis are in the same room, if you watch Peter's body language rather than listening to the dialogue, you see a character who is physically smaller than usual. His shoulders drop, his posture loses its characteristic confidence, he occupies less space. The animators built this into Peter's performance in Francis scenes as a way of communicating the emotional dynamic without stating it directly. When Francis eventually dies in season 5, there's a background detail in the funeral scene that several fans have noted. On the flower arrangement near the casket, there's a small card that reads simply, "Better than I thought you'd do." It's a joke, clearly. But it's also the one line Peter probably wanted to hear from his house father his entire life. The animators put it on a flower card in the background where almost no one would see it. Peter's interactions with physical comedy in the show are also full of hidden mechanics. The famous running gag where Peter hurts his knee and makes that specific noise while rocking back and forth, a gag that became so overused in later seasons that it grew exhausting, actually had a specific origin in the early show that is rarely discussed. The noise Peter makes was designed to be a very specific parody of a particular type of male stoicism around pain. The man who refuses to ask for help but also cannot pretend the pain isn't happening. It was a joke about masculine pride as much as a joke about physical comedy. In the early seasons, when the gag was used sparingly, it had that second layer. The later seasons stripped the second layer away and ran the surface gag into the ground. But if you go back to its early appearances, you can hear what the writers originally intended, and it changes the joke entirely. In terms of background visual detail specifically tied to Peter, one of the most consistently rewarding areas to examine is the Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland spend much of their social time. The bar's interior decoration changes slightly from episode to episode in ways that reflect the episode's content, or sometimes in ways that reference something happening in the production. In a season 2 episode, the dartboard on the wall of the Drunken Clam has a photograph attached to the bullseye target. The photograph is too small to make out clearly at normal viewing speed, but fans who have paused on the frame report that it appears to be a corporate headshot, the kind used in network promotional materials. The implication that the bar regulars have taped the photo of a Fox executive to their dartboard is a private joke in the classic Family Guy tradition. Pointed, brief, and completely invisible unless you're looking for it. The chalkboard behind the bar at the Drunken Clam is another area rich with hidden material. In the early seasons, the chalkboard lists daily specials that change from episode to episode. Most of these are throwaway jokes about beer. But scattered throughout seasons 1 through 3, there are chalkboard specials written in a much smaller font than the others. Details that appear to be references to the writing staff's own preferences, frustrations, or inside jokes. One of the more commonly cited examples involves a small handwritten note in what appears to be a different handwriting style from the rest of the chalkboard, positioned in the lower left corner and reading something that a fan community determined was a reference to a specific band that one of the writers was fond of. This is almost certainly the work of a single animator who added the detail during the production of that episode and never mentioned it. These anonymous additions from the animation team are one of the most interesting and least discussed aspects of Family Guy's hidden, detailed tradition because they represent individual voices within the larger production. People who left small marks on the show's world not for credit, not for recognition, but simply because they could. Peter's relationship with the Pawtucket Patriot logo, which appears on beer cans, shirts, posters, and bar decorations throughout the show, is another detail with more depth than it appears. The logo itself is modeled loosely on a Revolutionary War-era patriot figure, a man in a tricorn hat with a musket. In several background shots throughout the mid-seasons, you can find versions of this logo that have been subtly modified. The patriot figure is drawn in slightly different poses in different locations, as if he's been caught in the middle of a movement. This is not a continuity error. It's the animation team treating the Pawtucket Patriot as a background character of his own, moving him around the frame between shots the way you might imagine a painting subject shifting position when no one is looking. The gag is completely silent, never referenced, never explained. It exists entirely in the margins of the show's visual world. Section 3. Brian Griffin's Secret Life. What's hidden? In the bookshelves, the martini glass and the margins Brian Griffin is in many ways the character that Family Guy was most ambitious about. He's a talking dog who drinks martinis and drives a Saab and nurses a perpetually unfinished novel. In the first three seasons, he functions as something close to a conscience for the show, the voice that acknowledges when things have gone wrong, the character whose intelligence provides a counterweight to Peter's chaos. But Brian's character is also the one most densely populated with hidden details, literary references, and private jokes that reward a certain kind of attentive viewing. If Peter's hidden details are mostly about production history and character psychology, Brian's hidden details are about books, writing, failure, and the quietly devastating comedy of intellectual pretension. Start with the bookshelves. Brian's room and later his workspace at the Griffin House contains bookshelves that have been populated with real titles throughout the show's run. Most viewers register these as generic prop books, colored spines designed to suggest a literary environment without being specific about content. But they're not generic. The books on Brian's shelves in the early seasons have been identified by fans who paused episodes and cross-referenced spine colors and text with actual published works. Among the consistent titles, visible in multiple early episodes, several volumes of what appear to be 20th century American literary fiction, including what fans believe to be additions consistent with novels by John Updike and Philip Roth, two writers associated with a certain kind of educated, wine drinking, self consciously literary white American male. The choice of these specific authors, if the identification is correct, is a quiet joke about exactly the kind of writer Brian thinks he is and the kind of writer the show's version of critical success demands. There are also in the same bookshelves what appear to be multiple self help books. The spines are characterized by larger, bolder fonts and simpler color schemes, and they appear tucked behind the literary fiction as if someone was attempting to hide them. This would be entirely consistent with Brian's character, a dog who projects sophistication and intelligence while privately consuming the kind of aspirational self help content he would publicly mock. The books being present but partially concealed is a visual joke that requires no dialogue and no acknowledgement. It just sits there in the background, true to the character. Brian's novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, is one of the show's most extended hidden jokes because it functions as both a foreground plot element and a background detail across several seasons before it ever becomes explicitly story relevant. The novel first gets a name, that wonderfully terrible title, in an early episode where Brian tells Lois what he's calling it, and she immediately responds that she thinks it's the worst title she's ever heard. The show then drops the novel back into the background, where it exists as a source of periodic mockery and shame before finally being published in the season 7 episode titled 420, where it receives devastating critical reviews and sells no copies at all. Tom Tucker declares it the worst-selling book in recorded history. What makes this a hidden detail rather than just a long-running plot thread is the way the novel appears visually in the background of other episodes before its formal publication. Fans have identified what appear to be manuscripts, pages stacked on Brian's desk or visible on his bookshelves, in background shots across several seasons before the plot thread becomes explicit. These appearances are never acknowledged in the dialogue. They're just there, evidence of an ongoing creative failure that the character is trying to keep private while the camera quietly refuses to let it stay that way. The production team essentially built a visual biography of Brian's failure as a writer into the background of scenes that ostensibly have nothing to do with his writing. After the novel's catastrophic reception, a subsequent episode delivers what might be the single most quietly brutal visual joke in the show's history. Peter receives a large package in the mail. He opens it to find hundreds of copies of Faster Than the Speed of Love, unsold returns from the publisher. The visual of all those identical books, each one representing a failure that Brian can do nothing about, is played for quick laughs. But if you look at the individual copies before Peter begins tearing into them, each book's cover is slightly different. They appear to represent different printings or different cover design iterations, as if the publisher genuinely tried multiple approaches to sell this book before giving up. This detail is visible for maybe 3 seconds. It's an animator's private joke about the desperate optimism of publishers and about the particular kind of failure that results when even desperate optimism isn't enough. Brian's drinking is another area where the hidden details accumulate with unusual care. In the first 3 seasons, Brian's alcohol consumption is established as a quirk. He drinks martinis the way another character might smoke a pipe, as a signifier of a certain kind of dated would-be sophistication. The humor comes from the incongruity of a dog drinking martinis with an air of world weariness. But there's a detail that runs through these early episodes that is never commented upon. The Martiza's glass in Brian's paw is never quite full. In almost every scene where Brian is shown drinking, his glass is at approximately 70% capacity or lower. This is a detail about compulsive drinking that the show encodes visually rather than verbally. Brian is always in the middle of a drink, never at the beginning, because the beginning is a line he's already crossed long before the camera finds him. In later episodes, when Brian's alcoholism becomes more of an explicit plot element, this visual code is extended. There are background shots in episodes where Brian is presented as sober, plot level sober, narratively sober, where the attentive viewer can find a glass visible somewhere in the scene. On a table he passed, on a shelf behind him, in a kitchen he walked through. These details are presumably put there by animators who understood something about the mechanics of dependency that the script wasn't quite articulating. The object is always present, the character is always in orbit around it. This kind of detail, using visual language to say something the dialogue hasn't committed to, is exactly the kind of layered work that distinguishes the show's best moments from its lazier ones. Brian's Saab convertible is a detail that deserves its own paragraph. The choice to give Brian specifically a Saab sub, a Swedish car with an intellectual reputation, a car associated in American cultural shorthand with professors and NPR listeners and people who buy free range eggs, is a very deliberate character choice. It's not a random car. It's the car that a dog who reads Philip Roth and orders martinis would drive. And the specificity of the choice rewards any viewer who knows what a Saab represents in the landscape of American consumer identity. The fact that Brian drives it with his paws while wearing a smug expression is the joke. The car is the setup, and the dog is the punchline, but the punchline only fully lands if you know what kind of person drives that kind of car. This is a joke designed for a specific audience within the general audience, a joke that works on two levels simultaneously and that the show never explains or underlines. In a season 3 episode, Brian is briefly visible in the background of a scene set at a bookstore. He's browsing the shelves of a section labeled with a genre sign. The genre sign reads literary fiction. Brian is not in the literary fiction section. He's standing just outside it, looking at it from a distance of about 3 feet, with an expression that the animation team rendered with an unusual amount of detail, given that he's a background character in this moment. Slightly longing, slightly uncertain, slightly self-conscious. He doesn't enter the section. The scene moves on. Detail requires a pause to catch and a moment of stillness to interpret. But it is a complete, quiet, devastating character moment delivered entirely through background animation. Brian wants to be a literary fiction writer. He can't quite bring himself to belong to that section. He stands outside it and looks. The relationship between Brian and Stewie in the background of episodes, not in the explicit dialogue between them, but in the subtle visual language of their shared scenes, is a trove of hidden detail that most people have never systematically examined. In the early seasons, when their friendship was still forming, and Stewie was still primarily defined by his villainous nature, there are numerous background shots in which Stewie and Brian occupy the same space while clearly not aware of each other. Brian is reading. Stewie is building something. They're in the same room but in separate worlds. These shots appear frequently in season 2, and they function as a kind of visual prelude to the friendship. Two characters orbiting each other before the writers formally brought them into relationship. The show was telegraphing its own future in background compositions before it committed to the change in dialogue. Brian's love life is another area where the background details tell a richer story than the foreground. In several early episodes, there are glimpses of Brian's apartment, his off-screen space, the place he supposedly retreats to when he's not with the Griffin family, and the walls of this space are decorated in ways that reward examination. There are framed photographs, none of which are clearly identifiable at viewing speed, but several of which appear to show women. Not family photographs, something more private. The photographs are always slightly blurred in the animation, always pushed to the edges of the frame, always presented with just enough ambiguity to invite speculation without demanding interpretation. The animators were building a suggestion of a romantic history for a character whose present romantic life was marked by persistent failure, a hint that Brian had once been involved with people who mattered to him, people whose photographs he kept on his walls, people whose absence now was part of why he drank. There's also a detail in Brian's dialogue with Lois across the early seasons that functions as a kind of hidden emotional text. Brian's attraction to Lois is an established part of his character, but it's treated gently and subtly in the first three seasons in ways that are easy to overlook. What's less often noted is the specific way Brian speaks to Lois versus how he speaks to everyone else. With Peter, Brian is patient but sometimes tired. With Stewie, he's wary but fond. With Meg and Chris, he's benign but distracted. With Lois, he slows down. His cadences change. The animation team adjusted the speed of his mouth movements in Lois scenes very slightly, imperceptibly unless you're specifically watching for it, to create a subconscious effect of care. He chooses his words differently when he's talking to her. He's not performing intelligence for her approval. He's just present. This is the kind of detail that exists entirely below the level of conscious viewing, but that contributes to the overall feeling of the character's inner life. One of the best documented and most beloved hidden Brian details is the DVD prop in a yard sale scene in the mid-seasons. The Griffin family is having a yard sale, and Brian is sitting at a table with items for sale. Among the items on his table, visible for a few seconds of screen time, is a copy of the DVD for Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, a direct-to-DVD special released by the show itself. Brian is selling it at his yard sale. This is a joke operating on multiple levels. The show is acknowledging its own existence as a marketable product. Brian is apparently so indifferent to his own housemates' accomplishments that he's willing to sell evidence of them for probably $1, and the placement of the DVD on the yard sale table suggests it's something Brian doesn't want around his space. A private dig at Stewie that Brian is delivering through commerce rather than confrontation. The joke requires you to recognize the DVD, which requires you to be the kind of fan who is familiar with the show's expanded universe, which means it's a joke with a deliberately narrow audience. And that is, of course, exactly the point. Section 4. The Evil Genius and His Hidden World, Stewie Griffin's Background Secret Stewie Griffin. In the first three seasons of Family Guy, is one of the most specific and fully realized character concepts in the history of animated comedy. A baby, 1 year old, a diaper, and inside that baby, an intelligence so vast and so cold that its primary orientation to the world is one of contempt. A hunger for power, a desire for chaos, and one very specific and very consistent ambition, the destruction of his mother. What makes Stewie work as a character is the completeness of the illusion. He doesn't just talk like a villain, he lives like one. And the production team built evidence of his inner life into the background of his environments with a consistency and a creativity that makes his world one of the show's richest rewards for close watching. Start with Stewie's bedroom. On the surface, it's a baby's room. There's a crib. There's a mobile. There are toys on the floor. The color scheme is warm and soft. Everything about the visual environment signals innocence and vulnerability. This is, of course, the joke, and the production team committed to the joke so fully that they essentially designed two rooms. The surface room, the one Lois sees when she comes in to change Stewie's diaper, is the baby room. But in the background of this room, and in the spaces accessible from this room, there are details that belong to an entirely different kind of space. Equipment that no 1 year old should possess. Schematics pinned to the wall behind the crib at angles that are easy to miss if you're watching the foreground action. Devices on shelves that don't resolve into recognizable objects at first glance, but that, if you pause as and look, have the visual grammar of weapons or scientific instruments. One of the most discussed background details in Stewie's room is the presence of blueprints. In multiple early episodes, if you examine the wall behind Stewie's crib in scenes where Stewie is in the room, but the scene is primarily about something else. Lois feeding him, Peter checking on him, one of the other kids interacting with him. You can find what appear to be technical drawings pinned to the wall at angles that obscure their contents from casual observation. These drawings are not meaningless prop art. They have the visual structure of actual technical schematics, grid lines, measurement marks, sides, and top views of objects. The objects they depict are never fully visible in any single frame, but fans who have assembled multiple partial views from different episodes have assembled what appears to be a consistent visual vocabulary of devices, something that could be a directed energy weapon, something that might be a time machine component, something that resembles a targeting system. The production team built Stewie's evil genius existence into the background architecture of his room and then made sure the camera never quite confirmed what was there. The floor of Stewie's room contains details that are even more specific. In an episode where Stewie is shown playing with toy blocks, and the blocks spell out the word Red Drum, the backward spelling of murder famously used in Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining. The joke is immediately legible to any viewer who knows the reference. But in the same scene, if you look at the blocks around the spelled out word, there are other blocks arranged in patterns that don't form obvious words or obvious jokes. Some fans have argued that these surrounding blocks form partial references to other horror films or literary works. Whether this is intentional decoration or the animation team filling space with random block arrangements is genuinely uncertain. But the care taken with the Redrum arrangement suggests that the surrounding blocks were not placed randomly. The animators knew exactly what they were doing with those blocks. Stewie's time machine, which becomes a major plot device in middle and later seasons, appears in the background of several early episodes long before it's formally introduced as a story element. In these early appearances, it's not quite assembled. There are components on Stewie's workbench or visible in his closet that, if you know what the time machine looks like in its completed form from later seasons, can be identified as precursor components. This is retroactive continuity of a particular kind. Details planted in early episodes that only acquire meaning after later episodes define them. Whether these early appearances were deliberate foreshadowing or happy accidents of prop design is impossible to say with certainty. But the internal consistency of the visual vocabulary across these appearances suggests that someone on the production team was tracking the object's design history even before it became narratively important. There's a recurring detail in Stewie's interactions with other characters that functions as a hidden emotional register for his evolving character. In the first season, when Stewie addresses his family members, his body language is consistently that of a superior addressing subordinates. He stands slightly apart. He tilts his head upward. His hands are frequently clasped behind his back. This is the body language of a commander, not a baby, and the animation team executed it with precision throughout the season. But in season 2, something changes. In scenes where Stewie is interacting with Brian specifically, a relationship that was beginning to develop during this period, Stewie's body language is different. He faces Brian more directly. He is positioned at the same level rather than performing superiority. His hands move to his sides or in front of him rather than behind his back. These are small details of physical composition that suggest Stewie beginning to treat Brian as something other than an adversary or a subordinate, the earliest visual signs of a friendship that the script hadn't yet committed to. In the season 1 episode where Stewie first attempts a particularly elaborate scheme against Lois, there's a scene in his bedroom where he's consulting what appears to be a hand-drawn map. The map is visible for approximately 4 seconds. It shows what appears to be the floor plan of the Griffin house, but with additions, marked locations that don't correspond to any room visible elsewhere in the show's visual world. These marked locations appear to include what could be described as access points or hidden routes. The implication that Stewie has mapped the house's internal structure and identified ways to move through it that his family doesn't know about is entirely consistent with his character, but it's never stated in dialogue. It exists only in this background shot, a private document in a baby's hand, evidence of planning that goes far beyond anything the episode explicitly shows. Stewie's weapons cache is referenced directly in the show's dialogue at various points, but it appears in the background of several episodes before it's explicitly acknowledged. In a season 2 episode, there's a scene in the basement of the Griffin house where Stewie is visible at the edge of the frame, clearly present but not the focus of the scene. He's standing next to what appears to be a large covered object. The covering is canvas or something like it, the kind of thing you'd drape over equipment you didn't want casually observed. The object underneath it has an irregular, angular shape that doesn't match any piece of household furniture. In the context of who Stewie is and what he's capable of, the covered object is clearly some kind of weapons system or engineering project. The show never confirms this in the episode, but the visual implication is unambiguous to any viewer paying close enough attention to the background of that basement scene. One of the most cited Stewie-related hidden details is also one of the show's most elegantly constructed. In a season 3 episode involving a dream sequence, Stewie is shown asleep and the camera shows us the contents of his dream. The dream itself is a separate mini-scene, fairly brief, and the foreground content of the dream is what the episode is interested in. But in the background of the dream environment, the visual space that surrounds Stewie's dream action, there are images and objects that belong to his waking conscious mind rather than to the dream's own logic. These background elements include what appears to be a partially resolved image of Lois, not Lois as a person, but Lois as a target, rendered in the kind of abstracted graphic language that suggests a tactical representation rather than an emotional one. It's in the background. It's ambiguous enough that a casual viewer would see it as decorative imagery, but it's exactly consistent with what Stewie's subconscious would prioritize. Even in his dreams, she's still in the crosshairs. The show's treatment of Stewie's accent is another hidden detail of sorts, though one that operates through sound rather than image. Stewie's accent is often described simply as British, but it's more specific than that. It's a particular kind of mid-Atlantic, upper-class British accent, the kind associated with a very specific class of English society, the kind you'd hear in certain boarding schools or from a certain generation of BBC radio broadcasters. This accent has social connotations that a general American audience would not necessarily decode consciously, but that the writers absolutely understood. Stewie is not just British. He's the kind of British that implies a certain relationship to privilege, to tradition, and to the assumption of one's own superiority. The accent is a character argument delivered through phonetics. Every time Stewie opens his mouth, the accent is performing a claim about his self-image that the character never explicitly makes in words. The show eventually addressed Stewie's accent in a later episode where it's revealed that the accent is an affectation, that Stewie's natural voice sounds much more like Peters, and that the accent is a deliberate construction he maintains as what he calls a coat of armor to get me through the day. This revelation recontextualizes everything about the accent's function in the early seasons. The superiority it signals was always a performance. The character knew this, even if the viewer didn't. This means that every early scene where Stewie speaks with that refined authority is simultaneously a display of power and an act of self protection, and the detail that makes this retroactively visible is buried in a season 8 episode that most viewers wouldn't connect back to the character's first appearances. Stewie's mobile, the toy that hangs above his crib and that appears in numerous early episodes, is one of those details that appears in the background so consistently that it blurs into visual wallpaper. But if you pause on shots of the mobile across different episodes, the hanging figures change. Sometimes they're traditional baby toy shapes, stars, moons, simple geometric forms. Other times they're figures that don't belong in a baby's room at all. Miniature humanoid forms with postures that suggest distress or objects that have the visual grammar of weapons rather than toys. The changes are never dramatic enough to call explicit attention to themselves, but they're consistent enough across the first two seasons that the production team was clearly treating the mobile as a location for private editorial commentary on Stewie's inner life, changing it to reflect where the character was in a given episode's emotional arc, with nobody expecting the viewers to notice. There is one Stewie detail that sits outside the category of hidden visual details, but that belongs in this discussion because of how it operates on a viewer who knows about it. In the episode Stewie Kills Lois, the two-part season 6 story where Stewie apparently achieves his lifelong goal, the production team made a choice that is discussed by fans for years. The episode's treatment of Stewie's violence is markedly different from anything in the previous 5 seasons. It's more graphic, it's more clinical, it's less comedic. The Stewie who finally shoots Lois in this episode is not the comedic supervillain of seasons 1 through 3. He's something quieter and more disturbing, a character who has clearly been waiting for this moment for a very long time, and who approaches it with a calm that is, in context, more chilling than any amount of theatrical villainy would be. The production team changed the aesthetic register of the violence in this episode specifically to mark it as different, as something that was supposed to feel consequential, even though the two-parter ultimately resolves it through a reset. The episode is a farewell to the original Stewie, and the aesthetic choices in it are the team's way of honoring the character they were about to retire. Section 5. Meg, Chris, and the details in the margins. The Griffin children's hidden world Meg and Chris Griffin occupy an interesting position in the show's hidden detail tradition. They are, in many ways, the characters who receive the least attention from the production team in terms of deep world building, and yet their backgrounds and behavioral details contain some of the most interesting Easter eggs in the entire show, precisely because the production team knew they were working with characters who would often be pushed to the margins and so embedded the most personal and surprising details there. Let's start with Meg. And let's start with something that happened before the character was voiced by the actress most associated with her. The original voice of Meg in season 1 was Lacey Chabert, an actress who was simultaneously appearing in Party of Five during Family Guy's first season run. Chabert left the role after the first season, and from season 2 onward, Meg has been voiced by Mila Kunis. The transition was handled without announcement or ceremony. You'd never know from watching the episodes in order that the voice had changed, because the show made no reference to it. The character sounds different enough between seasons 1 and 2 that if you go back and watch them consecutively, the difference is immediately apparent. But within the show's own universe, no character notices. What's interesting about this from a hidden detail perspective is the way Mila Kunis's real-world identity occasionally bleeds into Meg's character in ways that the show embeds quietly rather than announcing. Kunis became one of the biggest stars in Hollywood during Family Guy's run, appearing in numerous major films and building a public profile that stands in almost comedic contrast to the character she was simultaneously voicing. The show occasionally acknowledged this. There are several episodes where characters reference real movies that Kunis appeared in, and Meg is present in those scenes, creating a quiet meta joke where Meg's voice actress is being discussed in Meg's presence without Meg being aware of the connection. In the crossover episode involving The Simpsons, background dialogue references the film Bad Moms, which Kunis appeared in a scene where Meg is visible in the frame. More subtly, in an episode where Lois is shown using Facebook, the production team built an actual functional looking social media interface into the show's visual design, and within that interface, visible for a few seconds in background shots, Mega sent Lois a friend request that Lois has not accepted. This detail is devastating in its simplicity and its commitment to character. Lois has not accepted Meg's friend request. The digital version of Meg is reaching out to the digital version of her own mother, and the mother has seen the request and chosen not to accept it. No dialogue is needed. The visual does the entire emotional work of the moment. Chris Griffin's background details are considerably more comic than emotional, and they cluster around his relationship to movies, pop culture, and his own body image in ways that the show leaves mostly uncommented upon. Chris's room is one of the most consistently detailed spaces in the Griffin house, and it rewards repeated examination. The posters on his walls change between episodes, but tend toward a consistent aesthetic. Large, bold graphic imagery, the kind of thing that would appeal to a teenage boy with a strong visual imagination, but limited critical framework. In several episodes, fans have identified specific posters that appear to reference films that would have been released and visible to a teenager of Chris's approximate age in the mid 2000s, which is internally consistent with the show's timeline, even though Family Guy operates in something closer to a flexible present. Chris's art is a detail that gets used explicitly at various points in the show's run. He's established as having a talent for drawing and visual art, but what's less often acknowledged is the evidence of his art that appears in the background before the plot formalized it. In multiple season 2 and 3 episodes, there are drawings visible in Chris's room that have his handwriting's characteristic quality, uneven but expressive, the kind of art made by someone with genuine visual intelligence working without technical training. These background drawings are not labeled as Chris's. They're just present decoration in his room that the production team created with a level of specificity that suggests they were thinking about Chris's artistic identity before the scripts made explicit use of it. The relationship between Seth Green's audition for Chris and one of the character's most famous moments is a hidden detail that operates in the space between production history and the show's own fiction. When Green auditioned for the role of Chris, he was apparently dared by a friend to perform his audition doing an impression of Buffalo Bill, the disturbing villain from The Silence of the Lambs who famously dances in a dress to the song Goodbye Horses. Green did the impression. It apparently contributed to his getting the role. Years later, in a season 4 episode, Meg uses video footage of Chris parodying that exact Buffalo Bill dance as a way to humiliate him in front of his school. The joke operates on the surface as a sibling revenge story. But the choice of that specific dance for that specific character connects the audition to the scene in a way that turns a moment of character humiliation into a private celebration of the audition process that launched the character. Seth Green is being embarrassed on screen in the exact way Seth Green impressed people off screen. Chris's best friend in the early seasons is a character named Neil Goldman, a somewhat nerdy, obsessive figure whose crush on Meg is used for both comedy and occasional pathos. Neil's presence in background scenes is more consistent than most fans realize. He appears in the background of the high school and its immediate environs in episodes where he's not in the main cast, hanging on the edges of scenes, observing the action from a distance. This is the production team keeping Neil in the show's visual world, even when he's not narratively active, treating him with a consistency of background presence that elevates him from a recurring character to something more like a permanent part of the school environment. The effect, when you notice it, is of a person who is always there but never quite welcomed into the center of things, which is, of course, exactly the character. There is a quietly devastating detail in a background scene from a season 3 episode set at the high school. Meg is at her locker, and in the reflection of the locker door's interior mirror, visible for roughly 2 seconds, you can see other students walking past in the hallway behind her. None of them look at her. Not a single person in the reflection makes eye contact with Meg, acknowledges her presence, or gives any visual indication that she exists. The shot is framed so that Meg is in the foreground dealing with her locker while this stream of indifference flows through the reflected background. It's a visual expression of social invisibility that requires no dialogue, no plot justification, and no explicit acknowledgement. The character is alone in a crowd, and the production team put that fact on screen using nothing but reflective surfaces and visual composition. Meg's room is decorated with posters of celebrities and cultural figures that are carefully period appropriate for a teenage girl in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but there's one detail in her room's decoration that appears with unusual consistency. A handwritten list pinned to the inside of her bedroom door, visible in several shots where the door is open. The list contents are not legible at viewing speed, but fans who have examined frame captures report that it appears to be a list of names, possibly classmates, possibly celebrities, possibly a combination. The production team seems to have created an actual prop list for this detail rather than a generic unreadable prop, which means someone wrote out what's on that list. What it says and why it's on Meg's door remain part of Family Guy's accumulated mystery. Section 6, the Griffin House that shouldn't exist. Architecture, rooms, and spatial impossibilities. One of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of Family Guy as a visual work is the Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street, a building that operates according to entirely different rules than any actual structure on Earth, and whose inconsistencies are not errors but an embedded visual system of jokes, character specific spaces, and production history. The Griffin House, on the outside, is a modest two-story structure with a front yard and a backyard, and nothing about its exterior dimensions that would suggest the interior it contains. The exterior is consistent across the show's run, give or take minor animation variations. It's a fairly recognizable American suburban house type. 2 stories, gabled roof, modest front porch, the kind of house that says stable working class comfort without announcing anything unusual about the people who live there. The interior is a different universe entirely. The staircase from the ground floor to the second floor has a different number of steps depending on the episode. In some shots, it's 12 steps, in others, it's 8. In at least one clearly identified shot from season 6, it's 15. The landing at the top of the stairs is positioned at different heights relative to the ceiling in different episodes. The hallway off the landing is sometimes wide enough to comfortably walk 2 people abreast, and sometimes clearly narrower than that. These variations are partly explained by the changing animation studios over the course of the show's run, and partly by the elastic approach to set design that governs all animated television. But the Griffin House takes this elasticity to an extreme that goes beyond simple inconsistencies and enters the territory of deliberate absurdist architecture. The living room floor changed color between the early and later seasons, from yellow in the first few seasons to a consistent green in later ones. This is not a creative decision with an obvious explanation. The production team made this change, and there has been no official comment on why. The most common fan theory is that the color change was a decision by the new animation studio that took over production duties and that no one made the effort to correct it against the original model. But the persistence of the change and its consistency once implemented gives it the quality of an editorial choice, as if someone decided that the Griffin family's living room had simply changed color, and that this was not a mistake, but a fact. The circular rug between the couch and the television is another element that shifts between appearances. In some episodes, it's a particular shade of blue or teal, in others, it's red. In at least one episode, it appears to be absent entirely. Given the rug's visual centrality to the living room, it's a large, prominent object in the room's most frequently used space. Its inconsistency is impossible to attribute to oversight. At a certain point, you have to consider whether the changing rug is itself a joke, a domestic detail that is supposed to feel stable and permanent, but that quietly refuses to stay the same. There are rooms in the Griffin house that appear in single episodes and are never seen again. The most discussed of these is the downstairs bathroom, a bathroom on the ground floor that is clearly established in a season 3 episode, but that has no consistent presence in the show's floor plan elsewhere. Ordinarily, in the visual grammar of the Griffin house, all bathrooms are on the second floor. The sudden appearance of a downstairs bathroom and its subsequent disappearance from the show's spatial vocabulary is a detail that the production team apparently decided not to attempt to explain. Similarly, a fireplace in the Griffin living room appears in a season 3 Christmas episode, an episode where it serves a narrative function when an ember causes a house fire and is never seen again. The Griffin house has a fireplace, except it doesn't. Except it did, that one time. Stewie's room is one of the most topologically inconsistent spaces in the house, and its inconsistency is by far the most interesting. In some episodes, Stewie's room is accessible directly from the second floor hallway, with his door visible at the end of the landing. In other episodes, his room appears to be set back from the hallway in a way that suggests it's behind other rooms, accessible only through indirect routes. In a small number of episodes, Stewie's room contains spatial elements that shouldn't be possible given the exterior dimensions of the house, spaces that are larger than the house's footprint would allow, or that exist at angles that don't correspond to any exterior wall. The fan community has attempted to map the Griffin house dozens of times. The result is always the same: an impossible floor plan. The house as depicted across all its episodes cannot be built in three-dimensional space. It contains rooms that overlap, hallways that connect to contradictory locations, and spaces that appear and disappear based on the needs of individual episodes. At a certain point, the most productive response to this is not frustration at the inconsistency, but appreciation for what the inconsistency produces. A house that is, in a very strange way, alive. It changes because the people in it are alive and the show's needs are alive, and in that sense, the Griffin house is less a fixed architectural fact and more a responsive environment that the production team continues to build and rebuild every season. The backyard of the Griffin house is another area of hidden detail. In many establishing shots of the house from outside, the backyard is visible through the side yard gap between the Griffin house and the Swanson house next door. The backyard contains a tree, a small patio area, and varying amounts of grass. But in the background of the backyard, visible in multiple exterior shots across the show's run, there is a structure that has been identified as a small shed or outbuilding. This structure appears in some episodes and not others, appears in different positions when it does appear, and has at various times been identified by fans as the potential location for Stewie's weapons manufacturing operations, given that the house's interior would not plausibly accommodate the size of the equipment implied by various episodes' plot. Details: the shed is never identified by any character. It's just there, occasionally, in the background of exterior shots. A building that may or may not contain anything, that the show has never seen fit to explain. The walls of the Griffin house deserve their own examination. In the living room, behind the couch, there are two framed pictures that are among the most persistently analyzed background details in the entire show. The pictures depict a mountain scene, and they appear in so many episodes, across so many seasons, that fans began wondering what mountain it was and whether the choice was significant. The answer, which comes from a late season episode, rather than from the production team directly, is that the mountain depicted is Mount Quahog, a fictional peak within the show's fictional Rhode Island geography, established in season 18's episode Cat Fight. This means the Griffin family has been living under a picture of the local mountain, the mountain of their own town, the entire time. A small, quiet piece of local pride that waited almost 2 decades to be formally identified. Peter's personal spaces within the house contain their own hidden details. His side of the master bedroom is decorated with subtle references to his interests that are easy to overlook when the scene's action is centered elsewhere. There are sports memorabilia items on his dresser that change between episodes, sometimes representing real teams and sometimes representing fictional versions of real teams. There are magazines visible on the nightstand that have been identified in paused frames as publications consistent with Peter's established tastes. Hunting and fishing magazines, a tabloid, at least one publication that appears to be entirely food-focused. The care taken with these details is remarkable given that they're never direct referenced and that most viewers would never consciously register them. The Griffin House's kitchen is a space where the production team consistently embedded food-related humor in the background. The refrigerator's exterior surface, visible in kitchen scenes, has varying items attached to it. Magnets, notes, children's drawings, the kinds of things that accumulate on a family refrigerator. In several episodes, items attached to the Griffin refrigerator can be identified as references to things that happened in previous episodes. A thank you note in Stewie's handwriting in one episode, a school notice in Meg's in another, a grocery list in Lois's handwriting that includes items clearly beyond the family's means in a third. The refrigerator is essentially a visual scrapbook of the family's life, updated occasionally, consulted never, present always. The basement of the Griffin house is the house's most mysterious space, partly because it's used infrequently enough that it hasn't accumulated the kind of consistent visual vocabulary that the living room, kitchen, and bedrooms have. When the basement does appear, it's usually in service of a plot that needs a slightly threatening or unusual space. It's where things get stored that aren't supposed to be easily found, which is appropriate given the basement's cultural associations with hidden things and uncomfortable truths. In one episode involving Herbert the elderly neighbor, the basement becomes a location for what can only be described as a confrontation between different kinds of danger, and the production team staged this scene with unusual visual care, using the darkness and spatial ambiguity of the basement to create an atmosphere that is genuinely unsettling. The hidden detail here is tonal rather than visual. The production team understood that the basement was the house's unconscious, and they treated it accordingly. Section 7. Pop Culture Buried Alive. The show's deepest movie and television references Family Guy is operated as a machine for processing pop culture. This is fundamental to the show's identity. It exists in a perpetual state of conversation with the movies, television shows, songs, and cultural moments that surrounded it. But what most people don't fully appreciate is that the show's most sophisticated cultural references are not the ones delivered in cutaway gags, where the reference is the entire point. The most sophisticated references are the ones buried in background details, embedded in dialogue as passing mentions, encoded into visual props, or structured as jokes that only fully resolve for viewers who bring a specific and sometimes obscure piece of cultural knowledge to the viewing experience. The most extensive and most carefully constructed cultural Easter egg territory in Family Guy centers on Star Wars. This shouldn't be surprising. Seth MacFarlane is a well-documented Star Wars fan, and the show produced three feature-length Star Wars parody specials. Blue Harvest in Season 6, Something 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 Dark Side in Season 8, and It's a Trap in Season 9. But the Star Wars references in Family Guy predate and extend far beyond these specials, and many of them are hidden in ways that the dedicated viewer can find. Blue Harvest, the first of the Star Wars specials, takes its name from a real piece of film history. When George Lucas and his team were filming Return of the Jedi in 1982, they used the fake production title Blue Harvest to prevent crowds and media from showing up at filming locations. The phrase Blue Harvest, horror beyond imagination, appeared on crew gear and set notices. It's a piece of behind-the-scenes film history that is genuinely obscure, the kind of knowledge that exists in detailed film biographies and niche entertainment histories rather than general cultural currency. The Family Guy team named their episode after it not because it was a recognizable reference, but because it was a true one, and because the people in the writing room cared enough about the history to acknowledge it, even knowing that most viewers would never understand what the title meant. Within Blue Harvest itself, there are Easter eggs within the Easter egg. The cantina scene, which parodies the corresponding scene in the original Star Wars, contains background characters who are themselves references to other McFarlane productions. Roger from American Dad and Bender from Futurama both appear briefly in the Cantina's crowd. This is a moment of animated crossover that functions as a private note between television productions, a handshake between shows that share a creative lineage. Bender's appearance is particularly notable because Futurama is a Fox production that was, like Family Guy, canceled and revived, and his presence in the Cantina functions as a moment of solidarity between shows that had survived similar institutional difficulties. The Simpsons crossover episode, which aired in season 13, is one of the densest Easter egg environments in the entire show because both production teams contributed details, and the result is layered with references that acknowledge and comment on both shows simultaneously. The most famous detail from this episode is the fight between Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson, which mirrors the structure of Peter's recurring fight with the giant chicken. A clear reference to one of Family Guy's own running gags, suggesting that the Homer fight is being filtered through the show's own internal mythology. But there's a subtler detail. When Homer throws Emmy Awards at Peter during the fight, and Peter has nothing to throw back because he has no Emmys, the scene is making a very specific and very pointed joke about the critical reception of the two shows. The Simpsons won Emmys. Family Guy, despite being nominated for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, a historic nomination, the first for an animated show since The Flintstones in 1961, has never won. The fight scene is a comedy sequence on the surface and a comment on industry recognition underneath. The show's relationship with other Fox animated comedies is a rich area for hidden references. American Dad, which premiered on Fox in February of 2005, just months before Family Guy's own season 4 return, appears in Family Guy's background in various forms throughout the shared network years. American Dad promotional materials appear on background billboards and storefronts in several seasons. More pointedly, in episodes that comment on the Fox animation block, there are background signs and marquees that reference American Dad in ways that position the two shows as family rather than competition. When American Dad moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, there are episodes of Family Guy from around that period where the background materials referencing American Dad disappear from the visual environment. Not commented upon, just gone, a quiet editorial acknowledgement of a neighbor who moved away. The show's references to films from the 1970s and 1980s deserve their own extensive examination, and they're particularly rich because they're most often embedded in Peter's personal environment, where they function as character detail as much as cultural reference. Peter's established nostalgia for media from his childhood and young adulthood is as one of his defining character traits, and the production team built visual evidence of this into the spaces he inhabits throughout the show. Posters, memorabilia, and prop objects consistent with films from the late 1970s and early 1980s appear regularly in Peter's bedroom, in his space at the Drunken Clam, and occasionally in the Griffin living room. These objects change between episodes, suggesting that Peter continues to acquire and arrange film-related objects around himself, a detail consistent with the character's established relationship to media nostalgia. The Alfred Hitchcock references in Family Guy are unusually deep and unusually consistent. Hitchcock is a director whose influence on American film culture is enormous, and McFarlane has spoken about his appreciation for Hitchcock's work. The show's episode North by North Quahog, the season 4 premiere, is an explicit reference to Hitchcock's North by Northwest. But the Hitchcock references don't stop at the episode title. Within North by North Quahog, there are visual compositions that mirror specific shot constructions from Hitchcock films, and one background gag involving Jesus' license plate. It reads WID, as in What Would I Do? A play on the cultural phrase, What Would Jesus Do? Is positioned within a sequence that has a visual debt to the car chase scenes in Hitchcock's thrillers. The license plate joke is funny on its surface. The formal debt to Hitchcock is only visible if you know what you're looking at. The planes, trains, and automobiles reference that appears in an early season episode is one of the more discussed hidden cultural details in the show's history. In a scene where a character is delivering a speech, some of the speech's language and rhythm mirrors the famous shower scene dialogue from John Hughes's 1987 film, in which Steve Martin's character delivers a extended outraged monologue. The Family Guy version transforms this source material into something that works entirely on its own terms. The character delivering the speech is not doing an impression, and the scene is not a parody. The connection to the source material is a structural and rhythmic one that exists below the level of explicit parody. A viewer who doesn't know planes, trains, and automobiles would find the scene completely legible. A viewer who does know it would experience the scene with an additional layer of texture, a sense of familiar architecture in an unfamiliar context. The Wilhelm scream is a Hollywood sound effect with one of the most interesting hidden histories in film. A recorded scream first used in the 1951 film Distant Drums that became a recurring insider joke across the film industry, reused in hundreds of movies and television shows as a tribute to film history and as a private signal between productions. Family Guy uses the Wilhelm scream in multiple episodes, and these uses are layered in interesting ways. In some cases, the scream is used in exactly the context where you'd expect it, in scenes of action or violence where a background character is apparently hurt. In other cases, the scream appears in more unexpected contexts, used for comic deflation in scenes that have no apparent connection to action sequences. Finding all the Wilhelm scream appearances in Family Guy is a rewarding exercise in audio close reading because not all of them are where you'd think to look. The show's relationship with The Shining deserves extended treatment. Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of Stephen King's novel appears in Family Guy in more forms and through more references than almost any other single film, and the references range from obvious to deeply obscure. The red drum blocks in Stewie's room are the most visible, but there are also visual compositions in certain episodes, particularly in episodes involving close institutional spaces like hospitals and government buildings that mirror the unsettling symmetry of Kubrick's cinematography. There are hallway shots where the camera is positioned at the level of a child's head, looking down a long corridor toward a closed door that are unmistakably Kubrickian in their framing. These are not accidental. The production team's awareness of Kubrick's formal vocabulary and their willingness to embed it in a Fox animated comedy for no audience payoff other than the private satisfaction of having done it is one of the more quietly beautiful aspects of the show's production history. The robot chicken references in Family Guy are a particular kind of inside joke that operates entirely within the animated television industry. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, is also the creator and primary creative force behind Robot Chicken, a stop-motion animated comedy that airs on Adult Swim. When Family Guy references Robot Chicken, the characters are sometimes dismissive or condescending about it, which makes the references funnier for anyone who knows that the same man is voicing the character, delivering the dismissal, and creating the show being dismissed. It's a performer doing a self-deprecating bit through a fictional proxy, and the comedy depends entirely on knowledge that a significant portion of the audience doesn't have. The writers put it there anyway. Section 8. The crew hides itself. Production team references and personal signatures. Family Guy has one of the most distinctive traditions in American animated television when it comes to the practice of the production team hiding itself within the show's visual world. Writers, directors, animators, producers, and other crew members have been embedding their names, faces, and private references into the show since its first season, and the accumulation of these embedded details across more than 20 years represents a kind of parallel autobiography, the story of the people who made the show told in the background of a show about a fictional family. The most straightforward version of this practice involves names embedded in visual props. Storefronts in the town of Quahog have been named after writers and producers throughout the show's run. Background extras have been given names, visible on nameplates, hospital wristbands, or the kind of government documents that appear as props in bureaucratic setting scenes that belong to crew members. In a season 11 episode involving a news sequence, there is a reference to producer Cherry Chevapravadumrong in a background shot that positions her name on a sign visible for approximately 1.5 seconds. The name is unusual enough and distinctive enough in its length and composition that any fan who paused the episode to read the sign would immediately recognize it as something other than a random fictional name. This is the production team acknowledging their own existence in the show's world, not for the general audience, but for themselves and for the small fraction of viewers attentive enough to find it. There are also telephone book props used in several episodes, the kind of old-fashioned prop that animators often fill with random fictional entries that have been identified as containing real names of production team members interspersed with fictional ones. The phone book as a prop object is particularly rich for this purpose because it can contain hundreds of entries, almost none of which will ever be read by a casual viewer, and because a viewer who did pause to read it would be rewarded with a directory of the people who built the show's world. It's a guest list to a party that most viewers don't know they've been invited to. The practice of hiding faces is slightly rarer but more striking when it occurs. In several background crowd scenes across the show's run, fans have identified faces that appear to be based on real individuals from the production team, drawings that have the specific quality of a real person's face rather than the generic round shapes used for most background characters. These are not photorealistic portraits. They're animated simplifications of real faces, the kind of visual translation that a skilled character designer would create when asked to render a specific in the show's visual style. They appear in crowd backgrounds, in restaurant and bar scenes, and in the bleacher sections of sports events. the kinds of locations where large numbers of undifferentiated background characters are needed, and where adding a few specific faces is unlikely to attract attention. McFarlane's own private biography appears in the show in ways that go beyond the obvious fact that he voices four main characters. The Gumble 2 Gumble reference discussed earlier is one example. But there's also the matter of the Rhode Island School of Design, McFarlane's alma mater, which appears in the show's visual world in the form of details that only RISD alumni would recognize. The architecture visible in certain exterior shots of the Quahog Arts District, a fictional neighborhood that appears in several episodes involving cultural events, has elements that are clearly drawn from the RISD campus and the Providence Arts District that surrounds it. The signage, the building styles, the spatial relationship between academic buildings and student facing commercial spaces, all of it has a specificity that goes beyond generic art school imagery and towards something McFarlane remembered from his years in Providence. Adam West's involvement with the show, he played the mayor of Quahog until his death in 2017, generated a specific kind of hidden detail that spans multiple seasons. West was willing to commit to jokes that no other celebrity of his stature would have touched, and the writers rewarded this willingness by writing the mayor as one of the most consistently strange and specific characters in the show's universe. Hidden within the mayor's scenes are references to specific moments from West's real career and public life that the casual viewer would not have the context to decode. In a Halloween episode, the mayor's name tag reads Catman rather than Adam West, a reference to the fact that West had voiced Catman on The Fairly Odd Parents, a children's show, creating a joke that connects the mayor's animated identity to the actor's animated identity in a way that only exists if you know West's voice work history. The show's music department left hidden details in the audio track that are every bit as specific as the visual Easter eggs, but they require a different kind of attention to find. Walter Murphy, who composed the show's theme song and much of its musical score, embedded structural references to other musical works in the show's incidental music that are designed to be felt rather than consciously identified. In emotional scenes, the musical cues often carry harmonic elements borrowed from classical sources, not quoted directly, but alluded to in ways that create a subliminal sense of familiarity. This is a compositional technique with a long history in film and television scoring, but Murphy applied it with unusual care to a show that most people would not expect to carry this kind of musical depth. The result is that certain scenes in Family Guy carry an emotional weight that seems disproportionate to their content. And the reason is that the music under them is doing work the audience receives without registering. Ron Jones, who composed the show's music in the early seasons before being replaced, had a similarly distinctive compositional signature that is now recognizable to fans who pay attention to the show's audio history. Jones's music in the early seasons had a warmth and a melodic character that changed significantly after his departure. Going back to watch early episodes with attention to the score reveals a musical environment that is genuinely more supportive of the characters' emotional lives than the later scoring, a musical world that believed in the characters enough to give them themes. This kind of audio archaeology is rarely discussed in fan communities, which tend to focus on visual details, but it's as revealing as anything visible on screen. The writers themselves left traces of their own sensibilities in the show's hidden text through the kind of joke that a person with a specific education or a specific set of references would write. Danny Smith, one of the show's earliest and longest serving writers, contributed a distinctive brand of literary and historical reference to the show's background material, the kind of jokes that require a specific knowledge of American cultural history from the mid 20th century. Chris Sheridan, another long serving writer, had a sensibility oriented more toward observational comedy and character psychology, and his episodes tend to have subtler background details oriented toward character behavior rather than cultural reference. Learning to identify the fingerprints of individual writers in the show's hidden detail tradition is possible, and it creates a richer understanding of the show as a collaborative work with multiple distinct intelligences contributing to its world. The production code system used for Family Guy episodes is another place where hidden information lives. Each episode has a production code, a string of letters and numbers used for internal production tracking, and these codes are not random. They encode information about when the episode was produced, which season it belongs to, and in some cases, reference events in the show's production history. Fans who have systematically analyzed production codes have identified anomalies that suggests certain episodes were produced out of broadcast order, or that certain creative decisions were made at the production level that weren't visible in the aired sequence. This is the kind of information that lives in the gap between what the audience sees and what the production team knows, and it rewards the kind of dedicated attention that Family Guy's hidden detail tradition demands. One of the most surprising production team references in the show's history involves Butch Hartman, the creator of The Fairly Odd Parents, who provided voices for various characters in the first episode of Family Guy. Hartman's involvement in the pilot of Family Guy is a detail that most fans of either show have never registered, and it connects two productions that are usually discussed in completely different contexts. Finding Hartman in the credits of Family Guy's first episode and then tracing his connection to the show's later references to Fairly Odd Parents, including the Adam West Catman joke discussed earlier, reveals a web of personal and professional connections between the people who built American animated television in the late 1990s and early 2000s that is far more intimate and interconnected than its public presentation suggests. Section 9, The Long Game. Easter eggs that span seasons and reward patience. Some of Family Guy's most extraordinary hidden details are not contained in single episodes. They are distributed across multiple seasons, sometimes separated by years of production, and they only fully reveal themselves to the viewer who has watched enough of the show in enough detail to recognize when a detail from an old episode is paying off in a new one. These are the show's long game Easter eggs, the hidden threads that the writers wove through the fabric of the show and left for the most dedicated viewers to pull. The thread of Brian's novel is the most extensively documented of these long game details, and it works in ways that are more sophisticated than a simple recurring joke. The novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, is first mentioned in a season 2 episode, receives its title some in a season 3 episode, is explicitly shown being worked on in brief background shots across several subsequent seasons, is published to devastating failure in season 7, and then becomes the source of a second book, Wish It, Want It, Do It, in season 9, after Stewie encourages Brian to keep writing. The arc of Brian's writing career, from aspiration to failure to a different kind of failure, the success of a self help book rather than a literary novel, is one of the show's longest running character stories, and it's distributed across the background of episodes rather than being confined to explicit story arcs. What makes this particularly interesting from a hidden detail perspective is the moment in season 9 where Brian receives hundreds of returned copies of Faster Than the Speed of Love in the mail. This moment only fully lands if you've been tracking the novel across the previous several seasons, if you've seen the brief background shots of the manuscript, caught the Stewie references to the novel's slow progress, and registered the publication moment in season 7. The failure of the novel is cumulative in a way that requires years of viewing to fully feel. For a viewer encountering the show through syndication or streaming in non sequential order, the moment lands as a quick joke about a failed book. For a viewer who has been watching the show from the beginning, it lands as the conclusion of an 8 season character arc. The same visual is two different things depending on when and how you came to the show. The recurring character of James Woods presents a similar long game dynamic. James Woods, the real actor, providing his own voice, appeared in Family Guy across multiple seasons as a version of himself, beginning with a famous season 4 episode in which Peter tricks Woods by leaving a trail of candy. Woods became one of the show's most beloved recurring characters, and his appearances accumulated into a genuine, ongoing story that ran through multiple seasons. When the show eventually made the decision to remove Woods from the show entirely, changing the name of the high school named after him, the decision was announced in a background detail before it was explicit in the narrative. The sign for James Woods Regional High School appears in a season 15 episode, in the background of a scene set near the school. In subsequent seasons, the sign is gone. The school has a different name. James Woods is no longer part of the show's world. The removal happened in the background before the foreground acknowledged it. The Stewie and Lois relationship over the course of the show's run carries its own long game detail. In the first 3 seasons, Stewie's hostility to Lois is absolute and entirely unconditional. He wants her dead, full stop. No ambiguity, no exceptions. But beginning in season 4, very small visual details begin appearing in scenes where Stewie and Lois interact that register a shift in the dynamic, a moment where Lois touches Stewie, and his posture softens by a degree that the early seasons would not have permitted, a glance from Stewie toward Lois that holds slightly longer than contempt would require. These small visual softening details accumulate across seasons 4 and 5 until, in the season 6 two-parter where Stewie finally apparently kills Lois, the emotional register of the episode carries a weight that it could only carry because the relationship had been quietly softening for 2 years. The audience has been prepared for the ambivalence at the center of the two-parter by details too small to articulate consciously but consistent enough to register emotionally. The Pewterschmidt family's hidden story is a long game detail that spans multiple seasons and that rewards the viewer who tracks the family background carefully. Lois's family, the Pewterschmidts, are old money New England wealthy, and their story is told in dribs and drabs as across dozens of episodes. What fans who have assembled the pieces have found is a consistent, somewhat surprising backstory. The Pewterschmidt wealth has a complicated history. Lois's childhood was defined by a particular kind of gilded neglect, and the decisions she made as a young woman, including her marriage to Peter, carry a psychological logic that becomes clearer the more of the Pewterschmidt backstory you've accumulated. This backstory is never told consecutively. It's distributed in flashbacks, in passing references, and in background details across the show's entire run. Assembling it requires the kind of sustained attention that most viewers never apply to a show like Family Guy. The development of the Swanson marriage, Joe and Bonnie, is another long game story distributed across background details. Joe Swanson's deteriorating marriage is a thread that runs from his introduction in season 1 through multiple seasons of gradual change, with the relationship's evolution visible in the couple's physical interactions in background shots of neighborhood scenes long before it becomes an explicit plot point. In early episodes, Joe and Bonnie stand close, touch naturally, face each other in conversation. In later seasons, their spatial relationship in shared scenes is noticeably different, more parallel than facing, more distanced, with less natural physical contact. The animators built the relationship's change into the couple's visual presence in group scenes before the writers formalized the domestic unhappiness in dialogue. The recurring background detail of the neighbor Herbert is one of the show's most consistent and most quietly dark long game elements. Herbert, the elderly neighbor with an unhealthy interest in young Chris, appears in background shots of Spooner Street in episodes where he has no explicit plot function. He's there in his yard, he's there on his porch. He's visible in crowd scenes at neighborhood events. The consistency of his background presence is itself a hidden detail about the nature of his character. He's always watching, always nearby, always on the periphery of scenes involving Chris. The writer's choice to keep him visually present, even in episodes where he has no dialogue or plot function, creates a background texture of unease that accumulates over seasons into something considerably more disturbing than any single episode of Herbert's explicit story would be on its own. The Cleveland Brown departure and the ripple effects it sent through the show's background details is another long game element worth noting. When Cleveland left Family Guy to lead his own spin off series, The Cleveland Show, the production team encoded the departure in background details that appeared across the transition period. Cleveland related objects and references that had been part of the visual background of the Spooner Street neighborhood quietly disappeared from background shots in the seasons surrounding his departure. His house, visible from the Griffin's yard in establishing shots, changed slightly in its appearance. These background changes are so gradual and so distributed that no single episode announces them, but the cumulative effect of watching the transition period is of a neighborhood slowly registering an absence. The show's self-referential tradition, characters acknowledging the show's existence, the writers, Fox Network, the ratings also operates as a long game detail in ways that reward the viewer who tracks it. The first instance of a character directly acknowledging the show's existence on television is a very early one, occurring in a season 1 or 2 episode as a quick aside that passes almost without registering. By season 4, these fourth wall breaks are more frequent and more pointed, with specific references to Fox's treatment of the show. By the later seasons, the fourth wall breaks have accumulated into an ongoing commentary on the show's own survival and decline that is only fully legible to a viewer who has watched the commentary build from those early tentative acknowledgments. The show's self-awareness grew across its run, and the growth was a gradual arc rather than a sudden shift. Section 10. Sounds in the walls. Hidden audio details, musical Easter eggs, and dialogue you, almost missed television audiences, are trained to watch. The visual information in any given frame is so dense and so consistently prioritized that the audio track, the music, the background sound design, the half-heard dialogue at the edges of scenes, often passes through conscious awareness without ever being actively processed. Family Guy's writers and composers have used this tendency to hide an entire category of details in the show's soundscape that most viewers have never consciously registered. Start with background conversations. In scenes set in public locations, restaurants, bars, school hallways, shopping centers, Family Guy backgrounds are often populated with characters engaged in visible conversations. The dialogue for these background conversations is sometimes real and sometimes not, but when it is real, it's often specifically written rather than using the generic crowd noise that most productions employ. In a number of episodes across the early and middle seasons, fans who have used audio isolation techniques to extract background dialogue from crowd scenes have identified conversations that are structured as separate jokes, complete setups and punchlines delivered by background characters who are never the focus of the scene. These background jokes exist entirely outside the main narrative of the episode. They require no character we know, no plot context, and no acknowledgement from the foreground action. They're just there, small comedy pieces buried under the main program. The Drunken Clams background soundscape is particularly rich with hidden audio material. In scenes where Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland are gathered at their table, the crowd noise of the bar is more structured than it sounds at first. There are identifiable conversation fragments from other patrons, there is music playing at the bar's sound system, and there is the ambient sound of glasses and pool cues that creates a specific acoustic environment. The music playing in the bar's background has been identified across multiple episodes as a consistent set of songs, not generic bar music, but specific tracks that carry associations with the show's time period and with the characters' established tastes. The choice of what plays in the Drunken Clams background is a character detail for the bar itself, treating the place as having its own musical identity rather than simply using royalty-free background noise. The Wilhelm scream, discussed earlier in the context of film references, has its own audio archaeology that is worth examining in detail. The scream appears in Family Guy in locations that are not always the most obvious. In several episodes, it appears in scenes that are not explicitly action sequences. A character tripping, an off-screen collision, a situation that doesn't obviously warrant the theatrical violence of the Wilhelm's specific timbre. These unexpected placements are jokes for audio-attentive viewers. The humor comes not from the Wilhelm being used at all, but from the particular inappropriateness of the Wilhelm's dramatic register in the context where it's been placed. A background character dropping a coffee cup, accompanied by the full theatrical Wilhelm scream, is a different and more specific joke than a character falling off a building, accompanied by the same sound. The Conway Twitty gag, one of the show's most controversial audio choices, is a running bit where the show cuts to a full-length performance of a Conway Twitty song with no connection to the episode's plot. This gag is discussed elsewhere in this video, but from a hidden detail perspective, there's an audio Easter egg buried within the Twitty segments themselves. The specific Twitty songs chosen for these segments are not random. They tend to be selected from a relatively narrow period in Twitty's career and tend towards songs that have lyrical content that, when examined carefully, bears a relationship to the emotional or thematic content of the episode being interrupted. The interruption is the visible joke. The thematic connection between Twitty's lyrics and the episode's content is the hidden one. It requires you to know Conway Twitty's discography and to be willing to search for meaning in what presents itself as pure absurdist time filling. The show's use of music in emotional scenes carries hidden details in the form of musical quotation. When Family Guy plays an instrumental version of a well-known song under an emotional moment, choice of song is usually obvious. The music is selected for its general emotional associations and its recognizability. But in several cases across the show's run, the musical choice is more specific and more coded than it appears. In an episode involving Stewie's emotional vulnerability, the underscore uses a harmonic vocabulary borrowed from a specific piece of classical music that is associated with childhood and loss in the classical repertoire. The reference is not made explicit. No character mentions classical music. The audience experiences the emotional effect without necessarily identifying its source. This is mood manipulation through cultural quotation, and it's being done in a show that most people would not expect to operate at this level of musical sophistication. The theme song itself, composed by Walter Murphy to lyrics credited to Seth MacFarlane, David Zuckerman, and Danny Smith, contains a hidden structural element in its arrangement that is visible on a spectrogram, but not audible in the way most sounds are. The arrangement includes a series of brief horn stabs in the final measures of the theme that, when isolated and examined, form a rhythmic pattern consistent with a specific piece of mid century American popular music. Whether this is a tribute, a coincidence, or simply Murphy working within an established musical vocabulary is impossible to say with certainty. But the specificity of the pattern and its placement in the theme song's most memorable section suggest intentional design. Quagmire's catchphrase, the specific vocal affirmation he delivers in response to situations he finds appealing, has generated its own hidden audio tradition within the show. Because the phrase is so immediately recognizable and so strongly associated with a specific type of humor, the writers have used it in contexts that subvert its expected function in ways that are audible only to viewers who are paying close attention to timing and context. In several episodes, the phrase appears in situations that are not consistent with Quagmire's usual deployment of it, in moments of genuine tenderness, in situations of real danger, in contexts where the phrase's surface meaning is directly contradicted by everything else happening in the scene. These deployments are jokes about the phrase itself, comments on its automation, its reflexive quality, its function as a shield against genuine emotional engagement. They exist in the audio track as tiny editorial moments that the visual track never acknowledges. Stewie's monologues, particularly in the early seasons, are full of audio details that reward listening in a different way than visual scanning. The rhythm and structure of Stewie's speeches are modeled on specific rhetorical traditions, the patterns of theatrical villainy, the cadences of certain kinds of British oratory, the specific sentence structures associated with academic writing. Seth MacFarlane, who was trained as an animator but who clearly had a strong awareness of linguistic register, built these specific patterns into Stewie's dialogue as performance choices that add texture to the character, even for viewers who don't consciously identify the references. If you listen to Stewie's season 1 monologues with attention to their structural architecture, where the beats land, how clauses are balanced, when the cadence speeds up or slows down, you can hear a performance that is doing considerably more work than its surface content requires. The background television sets that appear throughout the Griffin house and in The Drunken Clam are a consistent source of audio Easter eggs. In scenes where a TV is visible in the background, the content playing on that TV is almost always specifically chosen rather than generic. The shows visible on background TVs include references to real programs, fake programs that are clearly parodies of real ones, and in some cases, content that bears a direct relationship to the scene happening in the foreground. A background TV playing content that mirrors or comments on what the main characters are doing, creating a kind of double image effect that the show never explicitly calls attention to. These background TV moments are one of the show's most consistent hidden detail traditions, and they reward the viewer who is willing to split their attention between foreground and background action. One audio detail that belongs in its own category is the use of what fans have called the sadness chord, a specific harmonic move in the show's incidental music that appears consistently in scenes involving Meg's mistreatment. The chord is not dramatically prominent. It doesn't swell or call attention to itself. It sits in the low end of the audio mix, present more as a feeling than as a sound. But it appears with such consistency in Meg-related background moments, in scenes where the humor of the moment is dependent on her suffering, that it functions as a private acknowledgement from the music department that the show understands what it's doing. The chord is saying, in musical language, that this is not nothing, that there is a real person being hurt here, even in a fictional and comedic context. It's a musical conscience embedded in the audio track of a show that was often accused of not having one. Section 11, Frame by Frame, Animation Secrets, Visual Jokes, and the Art of the Hidden Image Family Guy is an animated show, which means that every single image you see on screen was created by a human being who made specific choices about what to put where. Unlike live action television, where the background of a scene is often whatever happened to be there when the camera rolled, the background of an animated scene is always intentional. Every object, every person, every word on every sign was drawn by someone who decided to draw it that way. This is what makes animation so rich a source for hidden details, because the decision to put something in the background of an animated scene is always a more deliberate act than in live action. The presence of specific background details is always more meaningful. Family Guy's animation history is complicated by the fact that different studios handled different seasons. Rough Draft Studios handled seasons 2 and 3. Other studios handled seasons 4 and 5. Digital Animation and Yedim handled portions of seasons 6 and 7. Each studio brought different strengths and weaknesses to the visual product, and each studio also brought different sensibilities about what to put in the background of scenes. The hidden detail traditions of the show, as a result, vary somewhat between eras. The specific flavor of the visual Easter eggs in seasons 2 and 3 is different from those in seasons 5 and 6 because different artists were making the background decisions. Rough Draft Studios, whose work on seasons 2 and 3 is widely considered among the best animation the show ever had, was particularly notable for the expressiveness of background characters. In rough drafted seasons, background people have specific readable faces. They have body language. They appear to be engaged in actual activity rather than simply filling space. This approach created a visual environment where looking at the background of any given scene felt rewarding. There were always actual people back there doing things. This is the environment in which some of the show's most beloved background character jokes developed because the background characters were drawn with enough specificity to support jokes. The approach to visual humor in background art changed when the studios changed. The thicker outlines and stiffer character movement of the post revival seasons created a different kind of hidden detail environment, one in which visual jokes were more likely to be embedded in objects and text than in the behavior of background characters, because the background characters themselves had less expressive range. This is a general observation rather than an absolute rule, but it tracks with the experience of watching the early and later seasons back to back. The later seasons' background jokes tend to be more legible and more explicit: a sign, a headline, a visible prop, while the early seasons' background jokes are more embedded in animated behavior and facial expression. The production team's treatment of continuity as a visual joke throughout the show's run is one of the most interesting hidden detail traditions in animated television. Most animated shows treat continuity errors as failures, mistakes to be corrected before broadcast. Family Guy treats certain continuity variations as running visual gags, tracking changes in background objects across episodes and using them as private jokes for attentive viewers. The color of the Griffin living room floor, the contents of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the arrangement of objects on Brian's bookshelf, the number of pictures visible on the living room walls, all of these change between episodes, and while some of these changes are simple production inconsistencies, others are clearly deliberate, maintained with a consistency that distinguishes intention from accident. There is one category of visual Easter egg in Family Guy that is genuinely rare and genuinely strange: the single frame image. These are images that exist in the show for literally one frame of animation. At 24 frames per second, a single frame persists on screen for approximately 42 milliseconds, a duration that registers subliminally at best. Family Guy has embedded single frame images in several episodes, primarily during transitions, dream sequences, and rapid editing sequences. The content of these images varies from episode to episode, but they tend to be either crude jokes that the broadcast standards environment wouldn't permit at normal viewing speed, or images that carry specific references that function as private notes from the production team. Finding these requires frame by frame examination of the relevant sequences, and they're the hidden details most likely to be entirely invisible to the majority of viewers. The show's use of text in visual backgrounds is an enormous area of hidden detail, and it encompasses a wider range of formats than is sometimes appreciated. Storefronts, billboards, book spines, computer screens, phone screens, newspaper headlines, government documents, medical charts, restaurant menus, and countless other text bearing surfaces appear throughout the show, and a meaningful percentage of them contain text that has been specifically written rather than generated randomly. Restaurant menus and background shots have been identified as containing items that are jokes, either jokes about the characters eating at the restaurant, jokes about the episode's content, or jokes that are self contained and unrelated to either. Government documents visible in scenes set in official buildings have been identified as containing specific bureaucratic language that comments on the action of the scene. One of the most elegantly constructed visual Easter eggs in the show's history involves a newspaper prop that appears in a scene where the Griffin family is celebrating some achievement. The newspaper's front page features the family's photograph and a headline about their achievement. This is the foreground content of the prop, the part the audience is supposed to read. Below the photograph, in a smaller headline that requires a pause to read, is the line DVDs pause for headline joke, millions disappointed. This is a joke about itself. The newspaper has been designed with a secondary headline that acknowledges the specific act of pausing the DVD to read background newspaper headlines. And that tells the viewer who has paused to read it that they will be disappointed by what they find. The meta joke here is multiple layers deep. The show put the joke in the background, knowing that people would pause to read it, and then made the joke about the act of pausing. It's a comedy trap that the show laid specifically for its most attentive viewers. The show's treatment of its own promotional materials as background props is a consistently rich area. In several episodes, posters for fictional movies or television shows appear in background locations, on walls, in store windows, on bus stops. Some of these fictional promotional materials are for shows within the show's universe, fake programs that characters watch or that exist as part of Quahog's media landscape. Others are for real productions, either Fox properties or MacFarlane's other shows, embedded in the background as subtle cross promotion that is hard to call entirely accidental, given the self awareness the show demonstrates in other contexts. There are also visual jokes embedded in the credits. The end credits of Family Guy typically run over a segment of music, and the production codes, writer credits, and other textual information that appears during the credits roll have occasionally been used as locations for additional gags. End credit jokes are a tradition with a long history in comedy television, but Family Guy's versions tend toward the extremely brief and the extremely specific, the kind of joke that requires you to be reading the credits attentively enough to catch a single line of text in a category like additional voices or production assistance. The show's title cards, the brief textual summaries of the previous episode that appear at the beginning of multi-part episodes, are another visual detail area that rewards attention. In multi-part stories where the second part opens with a summary of the first, the title card summary is sometimes written in a voice that is subtly different from the show's expected expository tone, including commentary, editorializing, or additional jokes embedded in what presents itself as a neutral recap. These are easy to miss because they're on screen for only a few seconds and because the viewer's attention is typically being directed toward the upcoming episode rather than the summary. Section 12, the rarest finds, the deepest Easter eggs in Family Guy's history. We've covered a lot of ground. We've moved through the show's visual architecture, its audio landscape, its hidden text, its production history, its character psychology, its cultural references, and its long game continuity traditions. Now, at the end of this particular journey, we arrive at the rarest category of hidden detail, the ones that are genuinely difficult to find, genuinely specific in their origins, and genuinely rewarding in their implications. These are the details that require the most commitment to uncover. Some require knowledge that exists outside the show entirely, specific pieces of cultural history, production context, or biographical information about the people involved. Some require frame by frame examination of multiple episodes. Some require attention to audio elements that most viewers never consciously register. And some require you to hold contradictory information in your head simultaneously to see the same detail as both a casual background joke and a more considered artistic statement. Let's start with the upside down message. In a season 3 episode involving a car race, a Tron like sequence where Peter faces off against an opponent in some kind of futuristic vehicle, there's a moment where Peter's car pulls away and the camera follows him down a corridor like track. In the background of this corridor, written in text that is clearly painted on the wall, is a message. This message is upside down. It says, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." This is a joke that requires the viewer to either notice the upside down text and turn their screen to read it, or to already have heard about the joke and know where to look. Either way, the reward is a message that comments on the act of noticing it. Like the DVZ pause headline discussed earlier, it's a joke that knows you're looking for jokes and uses that knowledge as the setup. The upside down text is one of the show's most discussed individual Easter eggs, and it has the quality of a magic trick. Once you know it's there, you can't believe you ever watched that scene without seeing it. The Barry Robinson detail is one of the most obscure and most beloved Easter eggs in the show's history. It requires a level of production knowledge that even most dedicated fans don't have. Barry Robinson was a background character, a boy who appeared in the background of the school bus and school scenes in the early seasons. He had no dialogue, no named presence in the script, and no particular visual distinctiveness. He was just there, a background kid. But he was drawn with unusual consistency across multiple early episodes, and the production team gave him a character Bible entry, even though he had no story function. When fans eventually located evidence of this character Bible entry, they found that Barry Robinson had been given an extensive personal background, a home life, a set of interests, a history, none of which ever appeared in the show. He was a fully realized character who existed entirely in the margins, built out in private by the production team for their own reasons, and never introduced to the audience. This is perhaps the purest expression of the Family Guy hidden detail tradition. A complete, invisible life, created and maintained in the background, never acknowledged. Just there. The dual language joke from a mid season episode is another genuinely rare find. In an episode involving international travel, there is a scene where characters interact with foreign language signs and text. The obvious joke is about language barriers and miscommunication, which is foreground content. But in the background of one of the foreign location scenes, there are signs in the foreign language that the scene is supposedly set in. If you can read the language, and the show's writers apparently expected that essentially no viewer would, the signs say things that are completely unrelated to the episode's plot, including what appears to be a note addressed to the animation studio from a writer on the show. This is a joke written in a language the show expected its audience not to speak, hidden in a background that the show expected its audience not to examine, leaving behind a private message that was addressed to no one in particular and everyone in general. The recurring presence of a specific phone number in the show's visual world is something that fans identified after extensive research. The number appears in various background contexts across multiple episodes. On fictional business cards visible in brief shots, on phone prop screens on the wall of the Drunken Clam in one episode. The number, when called by fans who identified it, connected to something specific rather than to dead air or an automated error message. What exactly it connected to has been reported variously, but the consistency of the number's appearance and the specificity of what it reached suggests that the production team placed it there deliberately as a reward for the most obsessive fans, an Easter egg that required not just visual attention but real world action to fully resolve. The shadow of Seth MacFarlane's own biography and the show's construction of Brian Griffin is perhaps the deepest and most personal of all the show's hidden details. MacFarlane is a writer. MacFarlane attended an art school. MacFarlane spent years working on projects that didn't fully succeed before Family Guy changed everything. MacFarlane has spoken about drinking, about failed relationships, about the particular loneliness of being very good at something in an industry that is not always interested in the kind of thing you're good at. The Brian Griffin of the early seasons is not a documentary portrait of Seth MacFarlane. He's a fictional character, clearly. But the resemblance between Brian's story and the emotional texture of MacFarlane's pre-Family Guy career is close enough that the character reads in retrospect as a kind of self-portrait, not a flattering one, not a self-pitying one, just an honest one. And that honesty, embedded in a talking dog in an adult cartoon, is the deepest Easter egg of all, the one that says that the person who made this show put himself in it and left enough himself there that the people paying close enough attention would eventually find him. The show's history of predicting real-world events has been extensively cataloged, and while some of these predictions are genuinely striking, most of them are better understood as something else. A show that is so deeply embedded in the cultural moment it inhabits, so attentive to the directions in which things seem to be moving, that its jokes occasionally resolve into something that looks like prophecy. The Kevin Spacey joke from a mid-season episode where Stewie makes a specific reference that would seem disturbingly prescient
Yeah.
years later, is probably the most discussed example, and MacFarlane himself has been clear that it was not based on inside knowledge. The Boston Marathon cutaway, where Peter causes catastrophe at a specific race that would later become the site of a real tragedy, is another. These moments are uncomfortable rather than joyful because the joke's resolution in reality is never a positive one. But they're part of the show's hidden detail history in the sense that they're evidence of how deeply the writing staff was paying attention to the culture around them, attentive enough that their comedy sometimes registered things before those things became undeniably visible. The final detail worth discussing is one that doesn't belong to any single episode, any specific background shot, or any individual production choice. It's the cumulative detail the thing that emerges from having watched the show closely enough for long enough to begin seeing its internal logic as a whole rather than episode by episode. Family Guy is often described as a show about chaos, random, disconnected, without the internal consistency that other great animated shows possess. But what close watching reveals is something different. A show with a very specific and very consistent set of preoccupations. A show that keeps returning to the same questions about family, failure, ambition, and love. A show that hides its seriousness inside its comedy, not because it's ashamed of that seriousness, but because the comedy is how that seriousness survives. The hidden details are the evidence of that seriousness. Every background name, every reverse text, every musical quotation, every carefully dressed bookshelf is a small proof that the people who made this show cared about it more than the show's surface suggested. They put things in the background that no one was supposed to notice. They wrote jokes in languages their audience couldn't read. They created complete invisible lives for characters who never spoke. They left messages for the people who would pause the DVD, look at the frame, and wonder what they were looking at. They left all of it for you. And tonight, together, we've found some of it. There's still so much more. The show has been on the air for more than 25 years. It has more than 400 episodes. The background world it has built over that time is almost incomprehensibly large, and what we've covered here is a beginning, not an end. But it's a beginning that gives you the right tools, the habit of attention, the willingness to pause, the patience to let the background speak. Take those tools back to the show. Watch it differently. Watch it slowly. Watch it in a way that the show itself was designed to reward, but that most viewers never discover. Because the thing about Family Guy's hidden details is that they were put there for you, not for the million other people watching at the same time. For you specifically, alone in the quiet, paying attention in a way that most of the world has decided isn't worth the effort. The writers knew someone would look. They hoped it would be you. It is. If you made it all the way to the end of this, I genuinely appreciate you more than I can say. The work that goes into something like this is enormous, and it's entirely worthwhile when the right person ends up here with it. If you found something here you've never heard before, or if something we covered gave you a reason to go back and watch the show differently, leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. It's a free thing you can do that makes a real difference to whether this kind of content can keep existing. New videos go up regularly. I'll see you in the next one. Section 13. Quahog After Dark, the hidden world of the town beyond Spsusa Street Family Guy's fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, is one of the most thoroughly and quietly detailed fictional settings in American animated television. Most viewers think of Quahog primarily in terms of the recurring locations: the Griffin House, the Drunken Clam, James Woods Regional High School, the Quahog 5 news station, and the various homes of the Griffin family's immediate neighbors. But behind and around these recognizable landmarks, the production team built a town with a remarkable amount of hidden texture, populated with recurring architectural details, fictional businesses with specific histories, and a civic life that carries its own logic. The name Quahog comes from the quahog clam, a hard-shell clam native to the Atlantic coast of North America and a staple of Rhode Island cuisine. The quahog is so central to Rhode Island's culinary identity that it appears in the official state emblem, and its use as the name of the Griffin family's town is a grounding choice, an anchor connecting the fictional geography to the actual culture of the real state. This is consistent with the general approach the production team took to the show's setting in the early seasons, when the writers and animators who had connections to Rhode Island and RISD were still most influential in shaping the show's visual identity. The buildings visible from the Griffin House tell a more specific story than casual viewing suggests. As noted earlier in this video, the buildings visible from the windows of the Griffin House in the first 3 seasons are based on real buildings in downtown Providence. This is not approximate or gestural. It's specific enough that people who know Providence can identify individual structures. The building that appears most frequently in the view from the Griffin living room window corresponds, in its basic architectural form, to a building on Westminster Street in downtown Providence, a street known for its mix of residential and commercial architecture that is characteristic of the Providence that McFarlane knew from his RISD years. This level of geographic specificity, embedded in a background view that most viewers register only as generic urban scenery, suggests that McFarlane and his early collaborators wanted the show's world to feel genuinely like New England, not a generic anywhere, America, but a place with a specific texture, specific light, and specific buildings. The Drunken Clam itself deserves more examination than it typically receives. The bar's name is, of course, a reference to the quahog clam of the town's name, a drunken clam being a kind of local absurdist joke, an animal native to the area rendered in a state of social impropriety. But the drunken clam's interior design is also carrying hidden information. The bar's decor in the early seasons includes what appears to be a genuine collection of New England maritime imagery: nets, anchors, buoys, photographs of fishing boats. That grounds the space in the actual visual culture of coastal Rhode Island. This maritime imagery is not generic bar decoration. It's specific to a particular kind of New England waterfront bar culture that exists in actual places along the Rhode Island and Massachusetts coast. The Drunken Clam looks the way it does because the people who designed it had been to the actual kinds of bars it's based on, and they cared enough about that specificity to put it on screen. There are also hidden details in the bar's background that accumulate across episodes in ways that suggest the production team treated the Drunken Clam as having a real business history. The specials board changes, the tap handles change, the collection of beer stains behind the bar changes in composition. The bulletin board, near the bar's entrance, visible in shots taken from certain angles, changes its postings from episode to episode with what appear to be real-looking community notices, event flyers, and the kinds of business cards that accumulate on the boards of real neighborhood bars. Some of these postings have been identified as containing jokes or crew references. Others appear to be genuinely functional-looking community notices that the animators created simply to make the bar feel real. The distinction between joke and decoration is often impossible to draw, which is itself characteristic of how the show builds its hidden world. The Quahog 5 news station is another location that rewards examination. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, and later Joyce Kinney, anchor the local news in a newsroom that the production team built with a surprising amount of internal consistency. The news desk, the green screen, the graphics visible behind the anchors during broadcasts, all of these elements recur across episodes with enough consistency to suggest a real production design document behind them. When the news station reports on local events, the graphics packages it uses for different types of stories have a consistent visual style that parodies real local news graphics while being specific enough to feel internally coherent. The fact that viewers are watching a cartoon news broadcast that is itself broadcasting news about events in a cartoon town creates a pleasing Hall of Mirrors quality that the production team exploits with occasional hidden details. Background. Monitors in the news station sometimes show footage that appears to reference events from previous episodes, treating the news station as a location with institutional memory of the town's history. The school, James Woods Regional High School, is a tall building that appears frequently enough to have its own accumulated visual vocabulary, and the production team built hidden details into it that reflect the specific texture of a New England public high school rather than a generic television school. The hallways have a specific kind of institutional green on the walls. The lockers are the specific dimensions and style associated with American public schools of a particular era. The cafeteria has a visual quality, the long tables, the specific kind of lighting, the service line design that is consistent enough across episodes to suggest a specific reference point rather than generic design. The school's trophy case, visible in several hallway scenes, contains trophies that have been read by fans who pause the appropriate frames, and the trophies appear to be for sports and activities consistent with an actual Rhode Island public schools extracurricular landscape. The cemetery that appears in multiple Family Guy episodes is a background location with some of the most consistently detailed visual work in the entire show. Tombstones in the cemetery bear readable text in episodes where the camera allows for close examination, and that text ranges from standard fictional epitaphs to specific jokes too, as noted earlier in this video, the occasional crew member's name. The cemetery is one of the few Quahog locations that has been drawn with enough precision across its multiple appearances that it has a consistent and identifiable layout, the same trees in roughly the same positions, the same pathway through the graves, the same fence line marking the cemetery's perimeter. This consistency is unusual for Family Guy, where most locations are drawn freshly for each episode, with varying degrees of fidelity to previous appearances. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter works for most of the show's run after leaving the toy factory, is a location whose interior and exterior have both been built with specific period-appropriate industrial detail. The brewery's interior has the visual grammar of a real New England industrial brewery, The scale of the equipment, the specific kinds of machinery, the safety signage on the walls is consistent with how an actual regional brewery of a certain vintage would be laid out. This specificity serves the comedy of Peter's work environment by making the workplace feel real enough that Peter's incompetence within it has actual weight. The Pawtucket Patriots advertising materials, which appear on signage, merchandise, and billboards throughout the show's visual world, have been consistent enough that fans have assembled a complete fictional brand identity from the accumulated appearances. The logo, the tagline, the color scheme, the mascot figure's various poses. Hidden within the streets of Quahog, across various exterior establishing shots over the show's seasons, there are storefronts and businesses that have been named and stocked with the kind of specificity that suggests actual businesses rather than generic fictional commerce. Some of these businesses serve as locations for plot events. Many more of them appear only in background shots during street level scenes, present as part of the town's visual environment without any narrative function. Fans who have assembled lists of identifiable Quahog businesses from background shots have found hundreds of entries, restaurants, retail stores, service businesses, professional offices, each with a name, a visible signage style, and in some cases, readable window text. Among these background businesses are names that have been identified as references to the production team, to Rhode Island geography, to McFarlane's biography, and to cultural touchstones that the writers cared about enough to embed in a fictional streetscape that most viewers would never closely examine. The Providence based architecture visible throughout the show's visuals world is concentrated most heavily in the show's early seasons when the visual design was most directly supervised by people with personal connections to Rhode Island. As the show aged and the production expanded, this specificity became diluted. The backgrounds of later season Quag look more like generic, animated American town than like a specific New England city. But going back to seasons 1 through 3 with the geographical awareness that the early backgrounds were drawn from real places creates a different viewing experience. You're watching a fictional family in a fictional town that is also, in some specific and sense, an animated portrait of a real place and the people who knew it. There is a particularly striking detail in the show's geographic world that involves the relationship between Quahog's fictional geography and Rhode Island's actual geography. Quahog is consistently described as being on the shore. It has a waterfront, a harbor, access to the ocean, and the specific placement of Rhode Island landmarks referenced in the show's dialogue corresponds approximately to a real coastal location in Rhode Island that places Quahog somewhere in the vicinity of Warwick or Cranston on the western shore of Narragansett Bay. This is an unusual level of geographic specificity for a fictional town in an animated show, and it's the kind of detail that only registers if you know the geography of the real state well enough to make the calculation. The show never makes this placement explicit. It's embedded in the background of background information, a coordinate on an invisible map that most viewers never realize they're inside. Section 14. The Simpsons is in a room. Hidden comparisons, competitions, and conversations between shows Family Guy exist in a permanent, complex, and endlessly fascinating relationship with The Simpsons, the show that defined the territory of the adult animated family sitcom before Family Guy arrived to complicate and extend it. This relationship has been a source of some of Family Guy's most interesting hidden details because the show's writers are simultaneously influenced by, competitive with, and deeply aware of The Simpsons in ways that show up throughout the Family Guy text in references that range from obvious to nearly invisible. The obvious layer of this relationship is the one that gets discussed most. The show's occasional direct parodies and acknowledgments of The Simpsons, including the crossover episode in season 13. But the hidden layer is considerably more interesting because it involves the ways Family Guy has quietly positioned itself in relation to its predecessor without ever making the relationship explicitly the subject of the episode. Start with a structural detail that connects the two shows on the level of premise. Both shows are built around a family whose cast includes a hapless father, a competent wife, an unpopular daughter, a son with a specific kind of innocent strangeness, and a preternaturally intelligent younger character who functions as a commentary on the family's dynamics. The structural rhyme between Homer and Marge and Peter and Lois, between Lisa and Stewie, between Bart and Chris, is something both shows acknowledge, but the way Family Guy acknowledges it is largely in the background and in the negative space through deliberate choices about how the Griffin family differs from the Simpson family, rather than how it resembles them. Peter's specific brand of stupidity is calibrated against Homer's. Homer Simpson's foolishness is fundamentally optimistic. He's a man who wants to do right by his family and consistently fails, but the failure comes from incompetence rather than indifference. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Peter's stupidity was calibrated to a slightly different frequency. He was less charming than Homer, slightly darker in his obliviousness, with a streak of genuine selfishness that The Simpsons' Homer rarely displayed. The difference in calibration between the two characters' stupidity is one that the Family Guy writing team was clearly conscious of because the episodes where Peter's behavior most close mimics Homer's are the episodes where the writing feels least distinctly Family Guy's own. When Family Guy is most itself, Peter is not Homer Simpson with a different voice. He's a specific character with a specific texture, and that specificity exists partly in deliberate contrast to his predecessor. The Emmy Award joke in the crossover episode, Homer throwing Emmy Awards at Peter, who has none, has already been discussed. But there are earlier, quieter versions of this same joke distributed across Family Guy's pre-crossover seasons. In episodes where the show depicts a fictional television awards ceremony, the Griffin family is never among the nominees for whatever the ceremony is awarding. Background extras at these fictional events have been drawn wearing what appear to be lanyards or badges consistent with award show credentials, and the names on these badges, in the episodes where they're readable, are typically fictional rather than real. But in at least one episode, a badge visible briefly in an award show crowd scene appears to read Springfield, the fictional city of The Simpsons, as a location credential, a tiny detail suggesting that The Simpsons are at the awards, show that the Griffins are merely attending as background, extras in their own industry. The two shows' approaches to musical comedy are another hidden comparison worth examining. The Simpsons has a strong tradition of musical comedy, songs that are polished, structured, and consistently excellent. Family Guy's musical tradition is different. The songs are more likely to be sudden, more likely to be deployed for shock effect, more likely to break the episode's rhythm in ways that feel deliberate rather than integrated. But within the show's musical tradition, there are songs that are clearly in conversation with The Simpsons' musical tradition, songs that are structured in a similar way, that occupy a similar emotional position in their episodes, that seem to be responding to the precedent established by the earlier show. These songs tend to appear in episodes that are otherwise most clearly in dialogue with The Simpsons' general approach, and their similarity to Simpson-style musical comedy creates a kind of hidden acknowledgement. Yes, we know how they do this. Here's what we're doing differently. The critical tradition comparing the two shows is one that Family Guy has embedded directly into its own text in ways that are easy to miss. In several episodes involving characters watching television or discussing television, the dialogue includes references to critical discourse about animated comedy that clearly allude to the critical frameworks used to discuss both shows. A character describing a show as being about more than just its gags, or dismissing a show as nothing but gags, is deploying the critical vocabulary that has been used to compare Family Guy unfavorably to The Simpsons since the early 2000s. The show is quoting its own critical reception and embedding it in character dialogue, trusting that the viewers who know about this critical discourse will recognize it, and those as who don't will register it as a character moment without the additional layer. The South Park relationship is worth a brief examination in this context because South Park's famous criticism of Family Guy, the season 10 two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which depicted Family Guy's jokes as written by manatees randomly combining idea balls, is itself a hidden detail in Family Guy's text. After Cartoon Wars aired in 2006, Family Guy writers embedded several responses into episodes over the following seasons. These responses are not addressed to South Park by name. They don't stage an explicit rebuttal. Instead, they appear as background jokes or dialogue moments that demonstrate the specific kind of craft that Cartoon Wars accused Family Guy of lacking. The most elegant of these responses is structural. In episodes produced in the months following Cartoon Wars, the cutaway gags are noticeably tighter and more thematically connected to the main narrative than they'd been in the immediately preceding episodes. The internal structure of the jokes was improved briefly and demonstrably in response to a public critique, and the improvement was not announced or acknowledged. It simply happened, visible only to viewers who knew what the critique had been and were paying attention to whether the show responded to it. The specific critical vocabulary used about Family Guy, the phrase jumping the shark, the concept of flanderization, the idea of a show running past its creative expiration date, all appear embedded in the show's own background text at various points. These phrases show up on fictional television coverage of fictional shows, on the pages of fictional entertainment publications, in dialogue that is ostensibly about fictional programs within the show's universe. The writers were tracking their own critical reception and occasionally encoding it into the show's visual world, creating a private commentary on the discourse about them that only people steeped in that discourse would fully decode. There is a detail involving the specific year that The Simpsons reached its 100th episode versus the year that Family Guy reached its 100th episode that generates a hidden comparison in the show's own internal chronology. Family Guy held a 100-episode special event hosted by Seth MacFarlane and Alex Borstein in a semi-live format that acknowledged the milestone explicitly. Within this special, there are references to The Simpsons' own 100th episode celebrations that are phrased in ways that are technically complimentary, but that carry the ambiguous quality of a compliment delivered from a specific competitive position. The references are there, encoded in the special's format and content for the viewer who wants to find them. Ultimately, the relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons that the hidden details express is one of genuine creative kinship, complicated by competitive anxiety, the relationship of a younger artist to an older one whose shadow is unavoidable. The Simpsons made Family Guy possible in a very direct sense. It demonstrated that animated comedy could be built around a family, could sustain itself over multiple seasons, could appeal to adult audiences while remaining accessible to younger ones. Family Guy absorbed that lesson and then spent its entire run trying to differentiate itself from the show it learned from. The hidden details in Family Guy that acknowledge The Simpsons are not just jokes or inside references. They're the show thinking out loud about who it is in relation to who it came from. Section 15. The night the show almost didn't exist. Hidden production history details. The production history of Family Guy is full of moments where the show almost didn't make it, and many of these near-death experiences left traces in the show's text that the most attentive viewers can find. These are details that only make sense if you know the show's behind-the-scenes history, moments where the production team encoded their own experience of making the show into the show's content in ways that simultaneously function as comedy and as historical record. The first cancellation in 2002, after 3 seasons, when Fox pulled the show off the air, citing poor ratings that were partly the consequence Fox's own scheduling mismanagement, left specific traces in the episodes produced immediately before and after the cancellation decision. In the final episodes of season 3, there are moments of unusual tonal weight in the background of otherwise comedic scenes. Extra care taken with certain visual compositions, dialogue moments that feel like they're carrying more freight than the immediate plot requires, character interactions that seem to be reaching for something that the episode's surface content doesn't quite warrant. These are the marks of a production team that knew the show was likely ending and was putting something extra into each episode in case it was the last one. The Stewie Griffin, the Untold Story direct-to-DVD special produced during the cancellation period in an attempt to capitalize on the show, Adult Swim popularity contains what fans have described as the most concentrated collection of hidden production anxiety details in the show's history. The special was made with an unusual degree of freedom. It was direct to DVD rather than broadcast, which meant it wasn't subject to the same standards restrictions, and it was made at a moment when the show's future was genuinely uncertain. The content reflects this freedom and this uncertainty in ways that are visible both in the explicit narrative and in the background details. Jokes that would not have been possible in the broadcast versions of the show appear throughout the special. More interestingly, there are moments where the fourth wall breaks down entirely, not in the way the show occasionally used for laughs, but in a more existential way, with characters acknowledging the uncertainty of the show's future in terms that are clearly coming from the production team rather than from the characters' fictional perspectives. The revival in 2005 is itself one of the most remarkable stories in American television history, and the production team marked it in hidden ways that spread across the season 4 premiere and several subsequent episodes. When Family Guy came back for season 4 with the episode North by North Quahog, there are multiple small visual details that acknowledge the 3-year absence. Background objects in the Griffin house that were present in early season 3 episodes are returned to their original positions in the season 4 premiere after an establishing shot of the house suggests that everything is back where it was. The return of these objects is a continuity act that required someone to look back at old episodes and ensure the background details were restored. The care taken with this restoration is itself evidence of something important. The production team was treating the revival as a genuine homecoming, not just a continuation of an interrupted run. The writer who left the show and the writer who stayed are both visible in the hidden details of the revival season. The writers who departed during the cancellation period had sensibilities that had shaped the early show's tone, and their absence created spaces that new writers filled with different approaches. Finding the seams between these approaches, the places where an episode's hidden details feel continuous with the early show's tradition versus the places where they feel like something new, is a form of textual archaeology that rewards the patient reader of Family Guy's background world. These seams are not always visible, but they exist, and they tell the story of a writing room trying to rebuild a show from components that were partially missing. Seth MacFarlane's near-death experience on September 11th, 2001. He had a ticket on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to strike the World Trade Center, but missed the flight due to a hangover and a travel agent is background context that shadows several early Family Guy episodes without ever being referenced directly. The show that premiered in 1999 and survived into 2001 was already dealing with institutional anxiety about its future. The events of September 2001 added a layer of personal gravity to MacFarlane's relationship with the show and with his own survival that never appears in the show's text explicitly, but that is present in the general atmosphere of the season 2 and early season 3 episodes. A quality of someone who is making each episode as fully as possible because he understands in a newly visceral way that there might not be a next one. The Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 and 2008 affected Family Guy in ways that are visible in the show's background details across the seasons surrounding the strike period. The strike, which lasted approximately 3 months, disrupted the writing process and the creative flow of the show's seventh season, and the episodes that bookend this period have a slightly different quality. Episodes immediately before the strike have a sense of stories being accelerated, of threads being tied off more quickly than planned, as if the writers were uncertain how long they'd have. Episodes immediately after the resumption show a similar quality of rebuilding momentum, of stories being restarted and reestablished. The background details in the pre-strike episodes are sometimes more sparse than comparable episodes from the same season, suggesting that the animators were working under time pressure as production scrambled to complete episodes before the strike began. The Fox network's treatment of the show across its history is something that the production team encoded into the show's content with a consistency that is remarkable given how commercially dependent they remained on that same network. References to network executives, to scheduling decisions, to the economics of broadcast television appear in background details across the show's run in ways that are never quite explicit enough to constitute direct criticism, but that are clearly not coincidental. The billboard that appears on a Quahog Street corner in one mid-season episode, advertising a television show with an unusually terrible title, is, fans have argued, referencing a specific Fox programming decision from around that production period. The episode that opens with a joke about shows that were canceled to make room for Family Guy's return is more explicit. It names real shows that Fox canceled, but the more subtle version of the same joke exists in background details across multiple seasons. A fictional canceled show referenced on a background TV, a fictional network executive character whose decisions mirror real Fox decisions from the corresponding period, a headline visible on a prop newspaper that comments on the economics of broadcast animation. The show's relationship to its own merchandise is another production history detail that appears in the background. By the show's third and fourth seasons, Family Guy had become a significant merchandising property. T-shirts, mugs, toys, and other products carrying the show's characters were becoming visible parts of American consumer culture. The production team acknowledged this in background details that embedded fictional versions of their own merchandise in the show's world. Characters wearing Family Guy branded clothing in a show about Family Guy characters creates a specific kind of recursive loop, and it was done subtly enough that most viewers registered the background clothing as generic without identifying its specific content. The experience of the show being moved between animation studios across its run is a production history detail that is more visible in the show's background art than anywhere else. The different studios that handled different seasons had different approaches to prop design, background architecture, and the rendering of small objects in the midground of scenes. Learning to identify these studio specific qualities, the thicker outlines of certain periods, the flatter coloring of others, the more or less expressive background characters of still others, allows you to date episodes by their visual texture with surprising accuracy. The show's background world essentially carries its own production history, visible to any viewer who knows what to look for. The complete creative picture that emerges from all of this production history is of a show that was made by people who cared deeply about what they were making under circumstances that were often genuinely threatening to the show's survival, and who expressed that care through the only channel that was always available to them. The small, private, hidden details that no network executive would read, no ratings meter would register, and no casual viewer would find. The hidden details of Family Guy are not Easter eggs in the modern sense of the word. They're not prizes hidden for fans to discover and post about online. Though they function that way in practice, there's something more personal than that. They're the marks that people who loved a fragile thing left on it while they could. The evidence that they were there, the proof that it mattered to them. Section 16, the inventory of small wonders, a final walk through the show's most quietly perfect details. There's a quality to the best hidden details in any long running show that is hard to name exactly, but you know it when you encounter it. The sense that the person who put this here cared more than they had to, that they stayed later, drew more carefully, wrote more specifically, paid more attention than anyone would have asked them to or expected them to. That the detail exists not because it serves the show's plot or advances the narrative or appeals to a wider audience, but because some quality of artistic integrity demanded it, and someone in the production responded to that demand at the cost of their own time and energy. Family Guy has an enormous quantity of this kind of detail. Most of it lives in the background of episodes that are better known for other things. Most of it will never be seen by the majority of the show's viewers. Some of it has never been seen by anyone other than the person who put it there. This is the nature of art that exists at the edges of things. It's made for no audience in particular, out of something that resembles personal necessity, and whether or not it's found is secondary to the fact that it was made. The final thing I want to do in this video is not to catalog more individual details, though there are many more to catalog. Instead, I want to inventory the categories of care that the hidden details represent, to name the kinds of attention that went into building the show's private world so that when you go back to the show and start looking, you know what you're looking for. There is the care of the animator who added a face to a background crowd that didn't need a face, who gave that face a specific expression that commented on the scene, who spent time they didn't have to creating a person who would be on screen for 2 seconds. This is the care of someone who believes that any work that's done should be done as well as it can be done, regardless of whether anyone sees it. This care is present in every season of Family Guy, in every era of the show's production history, even in the later seasons that are most criticized for creative laziness in the foreground. The background animators kept working with the same dedication while the show changed around them. There is the care of the writer who put a real book title on Brian's bookshelf, who looked up the actual author and the actual spine dimensions, and who made sure the book was the right one for the character at that moment in the show's development. This is the care of someone who understands that character detail lives in specificity rather than generality, and who was willing to do the research necessary to achieve specificity even when no one was going to notice. This care is one of the primary reasons the early Brian Griffin feels so complete as a character. The background details of his life were built by people who thought carefully about the kind of person he was supposed to be. There is the care of the composer who embedded a harmonic reference to a specific piece of classical music in the underscore of an emotional scene, knowing that almost no one in the audience would consciously identify the reference, but believing that it would contribute something real to the emotional texture of the moment. This is the care of a craftsperson who trusts in the power of craft itself, who believes that doing something right, even if the rightness is invisible, produces a better result than doing it adequately. This care is audible throughout the early seasons of the show in ways that become harder to hear in later seasons, which is itself a kind of loss. There is the care of the production designer who populated a fictional town with hundreds of businesses, each with a specific name and a visual style that was consistent with that name, who treated a fictional streetscape as if it were a real one that needed to feel lived in and specific. This is the care of world building for its own sake. The creation of a space that has more texture than any story will ever require, because texture is its own reward, and because the feeling of a fully realized world is different from the feeling of a functional one. There is the care of the showrunner who allowed the crew's names to appear in the show's visual world, not as a self-indulgent gesture, but as an acknowledgement that the people who built this thing were real people who left real marks on it. This is the care of institutional memory, of wanting the show to contain evidence of the people who made it, so that the show itself becomes over time a record of its own construction. The credits contain some of this information. The background details contain the rest. There is the care of the writer who watched a scene being produced, saw a background detail that was wrong or that was right in a way that was only interesting if you brought specific knowledge to it, and who took the time to make the change or leave the detail in place. This is the most intimate kind of care, the kind that happens in the gap between what's planned and what's executed, in the small decisions that are made between drafts or between animatics and final frames. This care is present in every episode of the show at some level, and it's the care that the hidden details most directly express. And finally, there is the care of the creator who, in the middle of building one of the most commercially successful animated shows in television history, kept putting parts of himself into the background. His failures, his anxieties, his loves, his literary tastes, his geographical memories, his biographical fragments, trusting that the show would be there long enough for someone eventually to find them. This is Seth MacFarlane's care, and whatever complicated things can be said about the show's history and about his relationship to it in later years, this particular care is not in question. He built a world and he put himself inside it, and he left the door open for anyone who wanted to come in and look around. The door is still open, the world is still there. Some of it is loud and fast and meant to be consumed at speed. Some of it is quiet and specific and patient, built for the kind of attention that most television doesn't expect its viewers to bring. The part we've been exploring tonight is the quiet part, the part that lives in the background of frames, at the bottom of newspaper pages, in the tonal ambiguity of underscore music, in the specific titles on a fictional dog's bookshelf. That part of Family Guy is genuinely beautiful. It's beautiful not because it's prestigious or profound in the way that award season television is expected to be, but because it's evidence of people caring more than they had to. In the middle of a loud, chaotic, commercially oriented entertainment product, a group of writers and animators and composers and designers kept leaving small, careful marks that said, "We were here and we meant this." And now you found some of what they left. And you can keep looking. Because what we've covered here is substantial, but it is genuinely only the beginning. Family Guy has been running for more than 25 years and has produced more than 400 episodes. The background world that exists inside all of those episodes is almost inconceivably large, and the people who built it were careful and specific and thoughtful enough that there are things in it that nobody has found yet. That's a remarkable thing to say about a show that most people treat primarily as background noise. It's also, perhaps, the most generous thing the show ever did for its audience. It built a world big enough and detailed enough and specific enough that there is always more to find, always more to see, always another reason to look again. Good night. Be kind to yourselves. I'll see you next time. If you've been watching this all night and it's helped you find some rest, that genuinely makes this worthwhile. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. The community that forms around these videos is something I care about deeply. Subscribe if you haven't, and take care of yourselves until next time. End of script section 17. The giant chicken, recurring strangers, and the people who live in the background. There is a specific category of Family Guy character that exists at the precise intersection of foreground, comedy, and background hidden detail. And these characters deserve their own dedicated section because they represent one of the show's most distinctive and most under-examined traditions. These are the recurring minor characters whose histories are distributed across episodes in ways that rewards a sustained attention, whose backstories exist in background context rather than explicit narrative, and whose presence in the show's world creates a kind of visual memory that the most dedicated viewers have accumulated over years of watching. The giant chicken, Ernie, as he was eventually named, is the most famous of these characters, and his story has been told and analyzed as more than almost anyone else in this category. But the hidden detail dimension of the giant chicken story is rarely the one that gets discussed. The famous detail about the giant chicken is the fights, the extended movie-quality action sequences that erupt between Peter and Ernie whenever they encounter each other. Fights that began in Season 2 in the episode Da Boom, when Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. The fights are spectacular, destructive, and utterly disproportionate to their cause, which is the explicit joke. What's less often discussed is the way the fight's frequency and intensity changes across the show's run in ways that mirror the show's own emotional register in the broadest sense. In the early fights, the sequences carry a quality of genuine uncertainty. There's something at stake, even if the stakes are comically undefined. As the fights continued across subsequent seasons, they became more elaborate, but also somehow more predictable, more spectacular on a visual level, but less surprising in their rhythms and resolutions. This trajectory mirrors the general arc of the show's relationship with its own spectacle, and tracking it through the giant chicken fight episodes is a way of watching the show's creative history in microcosm. The fights are still funny in the later seasons, but they stop being surprising the way they were in season 2, and that change happened gradually enough that you might not notice it if you were only watching occasionally. The more hidden story of the giant chicken is the one that lives between the fight episodes. Fans who have done systematic searches of Family Guy episodes have reported finding what appear to be glimpses of a figure consistent with the giant chicken's visual profile in the backgrounds of numerous episodes where he's not supposed to be present. Some of these sightings are almost certainly animation artifacts or similarities with other background characters, but enough of them are specific enough to the giant chicken's visual signature that the accumulation suggests intentional placement, the production, team hiding Ernie in backgrounds as a joke for the viewers attentive enough to find him. The recurring character Herbert, the elderly neighbor, has a background presence worth revisiting in this context. Herbert's backstory is one of the most carefully and quietly constructed character histories in the show, delivered almost entirely in background details and brief isolated moments rather than in explicit narrative. Across his numerous appearances, fragments of his history accumulate. He's a Korean War veteran. He has a dog named Jesse. He was apparently young and athletic at some point in his past. None of these details are delivered in a single coherent biographical narrative. They're distributed across appearances separated by seasons, each one tiny, each one adding a fragment to a picture that only resolves into a full image if you've been collecting the fragments for years. The background detail work done for Herbert represents something genuinely unusual in animated television. A minor recurring character, given the depth of characterization that most shows reserve for main cast members, with that depth delivered almost entirely through channels that most viewers never access. The Herbert moments that the casual viewer remembers are the unsettling comedy moments, the jokes that play on the obvious discomfort of his character's orientation. The Herbert that exists in the background details is considerably more complicated. A person with a history, a war, a loss, a longing that predates his current circumstances. This context is never made explicit in a way that would interrupt the comedy. It lives in the background, where it belongs, and it transforms the character for anyone who's patient enough to assemble it. The recurring characters in The Drunken Clam deserve their own inventory because the bar's background regulars have been given a level of visual consistency that goes beyond what most animated shows provide for background characters. There's a man who sits at the same end of the bar in almost every Drunken Clam scene. Same stool, same slump posture, same expression. He has no name in the show's explicit content. He never speaks in scenes where he's visible, but his presence at that specific location at the bar, across dozens of episodes in multiple seasons, creates the impression of a person who is always there. A bar fixture, a human piece of furniture, whose background permanence says something about a life lived in very limited spatial territory. Other Drunken Clam regulars have been identified by fans based on their visual consistency across episodes. A woman who appears in the same section of the bar on multiple occasions, a man with a distinctive hat who appears in crowd shots, a pair of figures who seem to always occupy the same booth in the back. None of these characters have been identified by name or given any plot function. They are simply present reliably as evidence that the Drunken Clam has a regular clientele beyond the four main characters. Their consistency is a hidden detail about the richness of the show's world. Evidence that the animators were thinking about the bar as a real place, with real people in it, rather than as a set that got populated randomly for each episode. Joe Swanson's background life, outside his explicit plot episodes, is full of details that reward examination. In group scenes where Joe is one of several characters, the specific way he positions himself, moves through the space, and interacts with objects around him has a consistency that reflects his disability in ways that are more honest than the show's explicit jokes about his wheelchair. He navigates certain environments with difficulty. His angle of approach to a table is different from the other characters. The way other characters instinctively organize their spatial relationship to him in a room reflects an unconscious accommodation of his needs that is never commented on. These are behavioral details that the animators built into Joe's background presence as a form of characterization, and they're more respectful and more observationally accurate than many of the explicit wheelchair jokes that the show's critics have rightly questioned. Bonnie Swanson's background presence is equally specific. She's depicted throughout the show's run as a woman in a difficult position, married to a man whose injury has fundamentally changed the dynamic of their relationship, living with a complicated set of feelings about that change that she doesn't fully articulate. The background details of her behavior in group scenes, the specific expressions she wears when Joe is being celebrated, the particular kind of attention she gives to other men in social situations, the way her face reads when the camera catches her in the background of scenes where she's not the focus, all tell a consistent story about a character whose inner life is considerably more complicated than her occasional appearances as a supportive spouse would suggest. Cleveland Brown's background presence in the show's early seasons and his eventual departure to his own spin off series created one of the show's most interesting hidden detail puzzles. Cleveland was always the most understated of Peter's four friends, the one who reacted least, who was most likely to be in the background of group scenes rather than at the center of them, who seemed most content to let the conversation flow around him. In retrospect, this understatement reads as a form of hidden detail about Cleveland's character. He's a man who observes more than he performs, who takes in more than he gives back, whose internal life is significantly richer than his contribution to group conversations would suggest. The spin off series that eventually explored this inner life more directly was drawing on a well of character that the background moments of early Family Guy had been building in quiet ways for years. The character of Meg in the background of non Meg episodes, as her behavior in scenes where she's present but not the focus, her specific physical positioning in group scenes, the expression she wears in situations where the camera catches her before she's aware of being observed, tells a continuous and quietly devastating story about a person who has learned to expect nothing and who is perpetually surprised to receive even the smallest acknowledgement. These background Meg moments are distributed across dozens of episodes, unremarkable individually, cumulative in their emotional effect. The character's psychology is more fully drawn in these background moments than in most of the explicit Meg episodes, precisely because background moments don't have the pressure of explicit content. They can just be honest without needing to be entertaining. And so we reach the end of this particular walk through the hidden world of Family Guy. 17 sections and thousands of details, and we've covered the things that most reward patience and attention, the things that exist for the viewer who is willing to slow down, to look twice, to listen to what's underneath, to stay with something long enough for it to reveal itself. The show has given these things generously and quietly for more than 25 years. They're still there in every episode, waiting. The background is still full of things nobody was supposed to find. The books on the shelves still have specific titles. The newspapers still have second headlines. The walls still have messages written in directions you weren't supposed to read from. The music still carries harmonic memories of other music, other emotions, other traditions, and somewhere in the background of a scene you've already watched dozens of times, there is something you haven't noticed yet. Something put there by someone who stayed late, who cared more than they had to, who wanted the world to be a little more complete than anyone required. Go back and look. It's worth it. It always was. If you've made it to the end of this, from wherever you are in the world, at whatever time of night or morning it is where you are, thank you. Genuinely. Leave a comment with your location and the time. Subscribe if you can. And take care of yourselves until the next one. End of script, a final word. What the hidden world of Family Guy tells us about how stories get made. There's one last thought worth sitting with before we close this out completely. And it's a thought about what the existence of all these hidden details actually means, not just for Family Guy specifically, but for how stories get made and why it matters that people care about the work even when no one is watching them care. Every television show is, in the most mechanical sense, a product. It's made on a schedule, under budget constraints, with commercial objectives and network mandates that shape. So every decision from casting to story content to the color of a living room floor. The pressures of production are real and they're constant. And for most of a show's creative staff, most of the time, those pressures fill the available cognitive space completely. There isn't room in that environment for the kind of care we've been talking about tonight. There isn't time for it. There is no reward for it that the institutional machinery of television is set up to provide, and yet people do it anyway. The animator who adds a specific expression to a background face that no one will register. The writer who looks up the actual spine dimensions of a real book to put the right title on a fictional shelf. The composer who embeds a harmonic reference that only a small fraction of the audience is equipped to identify. The production designer who names a fictional bar the way you'd name a real one, with attention to the specific logic of a specific place in a specific kind of neighborhood in a specific kind of town. They do it because something in the work demands it, because the difference between doing it right and doing it adequately is perceptible, even when it's not articulable. And because some people cannot bring themselves to do work they know to be inadequate, even when adequate would suffice. This is what the hidden details of Family Guy ultimately document. The presence, throughout the show's production history, of people who could not stop caring even when caring had no institutional reward and no guaranteed audience. This is true of almost every long running creative work that repays close attention. The things that survive close reading are the things that were made with enough care to have something to yield to close reading. The hidden details are the residue of that care, the parts that weren't necessary, that no one asked for, that would never have been missed if they'd been omitted. They're there because the people who put them there couldn't help putting them there. And now you know they're there. And the next time you put on an episode of Family Guy, whether you're watching it for the first time or the 100th, whether you're watching it at midnight in a city you love or at 3 in the morning in a room that feels too quiet, you can look at it differently. You can look at it knowing that the background has things in it, that the walls have text, that the bookshelves have specific titles on specific spines, that the music is doing more than it appears to be doing, that somewhere in every episode, someone left something for you to find. They left it without knowing you. They left it trusting that someone eventually would look. Here you are. You looked. Sleep well. End of script. Total word count exceeds 30. Susan words. There's a strange intimacy in this kind of watching. When you slow down and look at the background of an episode you've seen before, you're not just watching the show, you're entering into a different kind of relationship with it. You're doing the thing that most viewers never do, which is to treat the show as if it were made with more intention than the surface requires. And the discovery that you're right, that there is more intention than the surface requires, that the background repays the attention, is one of the quietly satisfying experiences that attentive watching can provide. Most entertainment doesn't offer this. Most entertainment is exactly what it looks like on the surface. The compression and the budget pressures of commercial television production don't leave much room for the kind of invisible craftsmanship we've been exploring tonight, and most shows make no attempt to provide it. The existence of this tradition in Family Guy, a show that is sometimes described as the opposite of craftsmanship, as the exemplar of fast, cheap, disconnected entertainment, is genuinely surprising when you first encounter it. And then it stops being surprising because you start to understand the people who made it and the conditions under which they worked, and the hidden details become not surprising but inevitable. Of course, they put these things there. What else would you do if you cared about the work and had the space to leave a mark? The background world of Family Guy is a gift from the people who built it to the people willing to find it. It's been sitting there for more than 25 years. It has no expiration date. The Redrum blocks are still in Stewie's room. The actual sheet music for the theme song is still on Lois's piano. The newspaper is still waiting to be paused on. The wall still says what it says, upside down, for anyone who goes looking. You've spent tonight going looking. That means something. Sleep well.